It does a little count, and then it says this hangout is on air live. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I believe we have some viewers. I'm going to go to the window and pull the JD Kane here. Got to go to this thing. I got to hit reload, and then I got to hit. Oh, that was already muted. Hey, I got way ahead of myself. Welcome to everybody. Pop out chat. I will today. I promise. I will strive, try to follow the live chat. I'm very excited about this hangout today. I think many of us are kind of worn down by having our pool of conversational buddies kind of whittle down over the past long while, and I've met a new friend in the last few months on Discord. So Baptist, usually goes by Baptist702. I see. What was your name? What is it here? Baptist702. So he tells me you're familiar with the Hangout style. You've done Hangouts before. We've talked sort of intermittently on Discord, and as I put in the video description, I really enjoy talking with him or listening to him talk with other people, because he's very focused on the issues and very respectful and very courteous, and it's going to be something different from what had been on my channel in the last year or so. Basically, all the reasons why I don't like doing the Hangouts anymore are not. None of those reasons are present with Baptist. So I'm very happy to have a chat with him today. So why don't you go ahead and mute, tell us a little bit of something about yourself, and then we'll tell the audience what we were talking about, and we'll give her. So go ahead and who are you? What do you want to tell us about yourself?
Well, hello to everyone. Of course, as you heard from HogTieChamp, my name is Baptist702. I'll stick with my display name. I'll stick with my internet name for now. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. I'm currently active duty Marine. I am a Bible believing Christian, not perfect, still growing in grace. And I do take the presuppositional position that without the God of the Bible, you essentially don't have the justification or the proper foundations for establishing truth, logic, meaning, objectivity, truth. You essentially lose any sense of direction with these things, because you don't have the light of the very real person of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's essentially who I am.
You know what? So most of that I was familiar with. I didn't realize you were you're in the Marine Corps. I mean, you're not deployed somewhere today. I understand you're deployed. Do I want to say where you're deployed to today?
No.
Okay. Sorry. It's definitely not Marines related. So I thought that was an interesting observation. Yeah. So some of that I knew. So you're how long have you been in service?
About 5.5 years, almost 6.
Do you think it is sticking with it? Is that career path or a short-term thing for a period of your life, or what do you think? What do you want to be when you grow up? Is my question.
Well, I would say as of now, the answer is most likely going to be a no. I'm just going to do my probably 8 years. Yeah, about 8 years maybe, then go ahead and get on out. Try and see what I can accomplish more so as a regular person again.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. It's certainly an interesting path. It definitely gives you a lot of adventures and skills and tearing down and building up that a lot of the as you call them regular people don't. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what how that all plays out for you. Now, as I mentioned, you and I have spoken in the Discord. Actually, I typically enjoy that calm room on Discord. I find that they have very good radar for the trolls. So I'm going to if you don't mind, I'm going to do a little shout out here for a little plug for Matt Slick's thing on Discord. I generally speaking, I really like that calm room because it's a place for good conversation. It's not the same topics over and over again. There are obviously a couple of favorites that come up now and again. Presuppositional apologetics, certainly frequent appearances there. But and that Brojo fellow's in there, so you guys talk about comic book movies a lot, and so it's a good place. I would recommend it to people who enjoy good casual conversation, good sword play on some of these issues. I would not recommend it for trolls because they have a pretty broad base of moderators there that have a really good radar for the trolls, and you don't keep your head above water for too long as a troll. But I've heard Baptist talk. There's a fellow in there, Chris. I know. He presents as a deist, and he's knowledgeable about a lot of these issues. I like his style and conversation. I know Baptist has spoken with Chris. They've had a lot of back and forths. And even when it gets the most heated, I've never seen you guys blow up at each other. So they're very, very enjoyable conversations to listen to. So I'm really looking forward to a chance to talk about it today. I'm going to guess that I mean, Baptist and I kind of went back and forth with, well, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to talk about? And we're both kind of happy that it's just like, well, whatever comes up, whatever comes up. I'm quite sure Baptists will want to put some time in the gospel message, which is, on my channel, that comes up quite a bit. For my part in it, I'm hoping to enlighten Baptists a little bit, at least in the sense of why this presuppositional apologetics is actually not a very fruitful way of sort of embarking in a discussion about philosophy. Might even put some effort into showing that it's not even really a good method of evangelism, and he'll take that on board, or we won't. We'll see what happens. But I'm not going to really put my oar in the water to try to convince Baptists that he's somehow mistaken or crazy in believing that Jesus Christ is the living God. So we're good with that. We want to go that way.
Okay, let's take a look.
Unless you want me to convince you that.
Well,
we're going to take a run at it.
let's see where the conversation leads in regards to.
What's your normal, like, when you talk to a non-believer, what's your sort of the first concern or question you express?
Usually when I talk to a random unbeliever, I would bring up the question of what do they think happens after someone. I sort of take the way of the master approach at first, Ray Comfort, trying to slowly introduce, going through the law and the commandments, then finally giving the gospel message. And usually what happens is that they begin to give signs of having the strong atheist or weak atheist position. That's when I start to take them down more the apologetic path, the presuppositional apologetic path. When I start trying to show them how, the fact of the matter is that they're borrowing from the God of Scripture in order to properly reason and understand logic and truth, or let me put it this way. They're borrowing from the God of the Bible in order to try and reason their way into their unbelief, but I try to show them that essentially they are still borrowing from the Christian worldview. They're sort of saying, oh yeah, I'll take some of the good things about God. I'll take, the logic, the truth, but I'll just sort of reject Jesus Christ. Ultimately, I'll reject his authority because I love my sin. That's pretty much what most unbelievers would demonstrate whenever you take them down that path. But there are some who, when you take them initially through the way of the master method, and I would say that I'd say it's pretty half and half. There are some who, once you take them through the law and the commandments, they have the general understanding that they've sinned against God, they're in danger of hell without Christ, and they're willing to at least consider, based on what they at least say to me, they're willing to consider really thinking about these things and investigating it through either going home and reading the Bible on their own, or maybe going to church and getting, trying to understand these things, different things of that nature. But there are some who take the strong or weak atheist position. They're sort of like, I don't really believe, or because of science, because of evolution, things of that nature. And that's when I start to go down the more presuppositional apologetic method, or even evidential. It really depends on the conversation.
Okay, well, that sounds fair. I mean, I think one thing, this is in part, I have a bit of I know what your hole cards are a little bit, because I've heard you discuss this with people. And one of the things I've always wanted to ask you about is this idea about borrowing from the God of the Bible. And I think maybe we'll put a pin in that. It'll definitely come up very naturally. But so why don't we start with your usual starting point? Why don't we start with sin? Or sorry, either with sin, or you mentioned strong atheist and weak atheist. So maybe to sort of help sort of choose which path the Plinko chip is going to go on here. Well, actually, let's get the strong atheist, weak atheist thing worked out first. What's the difference? Like, if you needed to find out what my position was on that, what's the difference there I'm looking for?
I would say for a strong atheist, they have the position where I know with certainty that God does not exist because of science or because of scientism or my materialistic worldview. And that's when I usually begin to press them on on the reliability of their senses and reasoning, or their sense of empiricism or materialism. And usually you're able to point out the faultiness of their worldview not too long after that. And for the weak atheist, he's sort of like, he may take more of like the agnostic atheist position where, I'm not absolutely certain, but based upon the evidence I have seen, I don't believe God exists.
Oh, okay. I noticed that you've used the word certain in there a couple of times. I'm going to sort of strike that in the sense of, like, I'm not going to worry too much about responding to that, because I don't know necessarily what it would mean to know something for certain. is your measure of so let me focus more on the issue, I guess, what the propositions are. If you're saying, so there's a proposition out there, the Christian God exists, and we could call it proposition G. Christian God exists. So what I'm hearing is a distinction here that a theist would say yes to that proposition is true, where there's a type of atheist who would say that proposition is false. That is to say that the Christian God does not exist. And then another person might say, I don't take a decisive position either way. I don't accept the claim that the Christian God exists, but I don't jump headlong into the claims that the Christian God doesn't exist. If that's sort of the broad distinction between strong atheist and weak atheist, and we're setting aside this whole Gnostic versus agnostic thing about whether or not it's demonstrable, whether or not it fits the definition of knowledge, we'll set that aside for the moment. I guess I'll say what my position is that, I mean, my belief is that the Christian God doesn't exist. It's not mere, I mean, I don't, okay, I'm quite comfortable in saying I don't have a deductive proof, right? I can't prove if you were to ask me, hey, HogTie, is your position that no gods exist, nowhere, no how, never, ever, 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 prove that to me deductively? I would say, well, I can't do that. That's just not something that would be within my knowledge base or my skill set. But if you ask me like, hey, look, it's just a couple of guys talking, I want to know what you actually think about this, I'll say, well, I don't accept the claim that the Christian God exists. And you know what? The more I think about it, I would actually take the position it's more likely than not. It's actually my belief that the Christian God doesn't exist. So does that, but I don't want to say that I would somehow have the ability to construct or deploy a deductive argument towards that. Does that help you?
Well, whenever you say it's more likely than not, and usually just when I point out with atheists or agnostics who sort of take that position, is that whenever they're using the idea of probability, they're still relying upon terms that have absolute, objective, universal application in order to try and arrive at that position. And the problem is they still have to have that presupposition that the words they're using have, again, that absolute logical and objective application to every conversation everywhere in order to try and make that claim. And that's where the presuppositions deal more with the realm of certainty. And that's where we as Christians would come in with saying, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, Jesus himself, who is the very one who speaks is the final mouthpiece of God himself. So whenever we're showing to the atheist or agnostic or general unbeliever that they're still borrowing from the God of the Bible by using even words, by using a sense of logic and reason and truth, then but by rejecting the God of the Bible, they're pretty much saying, either one, excuse me, figuring out how to do, I have a tendency to burp a lot sometimes, but the fact that they're still trying to use these logical truths or logical realities, which indeed do correspond to reality as it is, otherwise you can't make any claim of any kind. You're forced to pretty much absolute agnosticism, or what's we're looking for. You're forced to pretty much say, the very words I'm using today could somehow change tomorrow completely. Like literally, if I said I made a journey to the store today, that could mean I bombed the Twin Towers, on 2001, and that's pretty much shows how there has to be, or there is, by virtue of what it is, by logical necessity, there is a logical, transcendent, objective application of words and phrases and terms in order for you to even call upon that, it's more likely than not that God does not exist. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I guess I'm wondering how broadly that goes, because obviously a lot of these discussions start with, as ours has, about a pretty broad issue about the existence of the Christian God. And then you say, well, to even sort of get in that discussion, these problems that you now identify. I'm wondering how broad that is. Like, say, for example, we were discussing something a little less contentious. Again, just for clarity, I think I'm pretty confident actually that you believe that the Earth is generally spherical in shape, which we can refer to as round Earth, right? So if we want to discuss something like, is the Earth round, or that there's a moon in orbit around the Earth, something like this, or the sun is hotter than snow. Let's take that one, pretty non-contentious thing. Suppose one day you said, well, hey, HogTie, do you take a position on the statement, the sun is hotter than snow? I would say yes. I'm very confident in my position. I would say yes, indeed, that proposition is true. The sun is indeed hotter than snow. Would you identify the same problems with it? Would you say, well, hold on a sec, HogTie, before you can make an assessment that the sun is hotter than snow, etc.? Like, how would you respond to a non-contentious claim like that? Would there be the same problems?
Well, for the unbeliever, we're not saying that the unbeliever cannot use logic and reason at all. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying they cannot call upon what's we're looking for. We're not saying they cannot call upon transcendent objective truths at all. We're saying that by virtue of them being outside of that saving relationship with Christ, they cannot properly justify why the sun is hotter than snow, or they cannot properly understand the deeper foundations of why the sun is hotter than snow, the more deeper philosophical applications or logical applications of that phrase without borrowing from the Christian worldview.
Okay, that light bulb fizzled on for me a little bit there, because now you're saying it has to do about the justification. So I can come to a position like the sun is hotter than snow, and I can express my subjective confidence that, personally I feel like I'm really confident in that belief. But that's apart from something like justification. Do I have a sufficient, a sturdy epistemic position? Right. I'm not just guessing. Like, for example, if we had a different sort of space-related conversation, the planet Jupiter has some number of molecules that make up the planet Jupiter, and that number is going to be an even number or an odd number. And if you were to say, well, HogTie, do you think there's an odd number of molecules in Jupiter? I would say, I really don't know. I'm just not confident about. I could take either position, even or odd, but I can't.
Well, I would say.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, in that regard, we haven't studied it or really discovered the full range of the molecules that are on Jupiter, or whatever planet there may be out in the universe. So, excuse me. But in regards to God, the God of the Bible, he has revealed himself to us. He has given us the revelation in the Old and New Testament, so we can study him and know him. So mankind, or even the very creation itself, does testify to a creator in the general natural revelation sense, but the more specific revelation of Yahweh, the triune God himself, is in the Bible, the Old and New Testament, revealed ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. So it's not to say that God is just out there in the ether and we don't know him. It's the fact that God not only exists, but he has revealed himself so we can know him.
Right. Okay. Well, those are points. Those are again propositions that I wouldn't accept as true. And just to pick one sort of as an exemplar for that whole group, the claim that God has revealed himself, that God has provided revelation, that's a claim that I would assess as being false. At the very least, I would say that that's not a claim that I would accept. I mean, personally, I would go a little further and say, well, that's just not true. But that's why I was sort of pulling it back to something that's non-contentious, because I want to see. Because it's too easy to disagree about something big and then show all the little disagreements that come along with it. If I don't believe in God, well, obviously I don't believe in God having taken some action, such as revelation. So just a moment, we'll get to that certainly, but just a moment to take it back to the sun is hot thing. Is that if you were to say, well, HogTie, do you have a position on the sun is hotter than snow? I'd say yes, and I'm very confident in that position. If he'll provide a justification for it, I think my intuition then would be to say, well, look, I'm very familiar with snow. I have firsthand experiences. I can put my hands in the snow. I know it's cold. And I have some limited experience with the sun. I've not ever touched it, but certainly when it's in the sky and not blocked by clouds, when it's in the sky, I can feel the heat, the radiant heat on my skin, a little less so when it's blocked by clouds, and not at all when it's on the other side of the planet. Also, I have the weight of, you often mention scientific evidence, right? There's a scientific enterprise out there where generations and generations, literally millions of people working in concert and communication with these truth-seeking strategies. And they tell me that the sun is awfully hot, that you couldn't even get close to it. So that's what I would do, Baptist, is I would lay out, if you say, well, how do you justify your position on the sun is hotter than snow? Those are the things I would lay out. I placed my own hands in snow. I felt the radiant heat of the sun on my skin. Scientific enterprise says this, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how would you, would that generate any discomfort? Would you then tell me, well, here's the problem with that, HogTie?
No, I wouldn't say you would. I would say you're by all means telling the truth, and that's what I'm coming to. That science is by and large reliable, but if we're talking about a non-contentious claim that, oh yeah, the sun is hotter than snow, well, we understand that yes, the sun is, by virtue of what it is and how it's made, that it is harder than snow. And scientific inquiry or scientific study does rely upon laws of logic, does rely upon uniformity of nature, does rely upon more transcendent philosophical presuppositions that could not be justified in the atheistic or non-theistic worldview. That pretty much would just be a lucky guess in regards to the the non-Christian perspective, but it's by virtue of what the Christian faith is, or the Christian perspective of science and knowledge and truth, that we're able to rightly conclude objectively in the universal sense that the sun is harder than snow. Because if indeed, according to the atheistic worldview, that we are just bipedal protoplasm, or just random molecules that came together just right over millions and billions of years, and all of our thinking is just brain chemicals, all of our sense of logic and truth and reason is just millions of years of evolutionary linguistics, then it just begs the question, how can we ever know that the words we're using today will have the exact same meaning several thousand years from now? That's essentially the point we're making, that yes, you can rightly say the sun is hotter than snow, and we would agree with you every single time. I mean, there's no, based upon the revelation of scripture and based upon, yes, science, and also the sun is indeed hotter than snow.
Okay, so go ahead.
Does that make sense to you?
It does. I guess the thing I'm feeling out for then is, would you accept if I said, let's say I do it this way, if I say, well, look, my belief is that there's an even number of molecules that make up Jupiter, and I don't know how to justify that belief, right? That's an unjustified belief. But if I say, well, and you would agree with me on that, I don't know why I'd come to that belief. But if I told you, no, I just personally have a good feeling about it, I think Jupiter has an even number of molecules, but I don't have a justification, you would say, well, look, I don't know if you're right about that belief, but gee, HogTie, you're right about not having a justification for that. What if I then said, I'm sure you'd agree with that, what if I then said, what was the thing, the sun is hotter than snow, and I do have a justification for that. I can support that belief with justification. I believe that's a justified belief. Would you agree that I have a justification for that belief, or would you? Because I actually, this is my actual position, by the way. I do believe the sun's hotter than snow, and I do believe that I have a justification that supports that belief. I would consider that in my view, a justified belief. Would you agree and say, yeah, HogTie, you're right, it's justified, or would you tell me that it's not justified?
Well, I would say in regards to that statement, I would say if we're still talking about Jupiter, I would say I don't know either. I don't know how many molecules are actually on Jupiter, but in regards to the sun is hotter than snow, I would say you can indeed say based upon scientific inquiry, scientific study, that the sun is hotter than snow. But again, we still arrive at the same problem, that in order to even use science, you still have to have that presupposition of the Christian world in order to properly justify that science is reliable, that science indeed is able to provide the necessary means for us to conclude that the sun is hotter than snow.
Yeah, that's the part I struggle with, is the claim that for me to reason, I mean, we're agreed that the sun is hotter than snow. That's the easy part. The question is then, is my belief that the sun is hotter than snow, is that a justified belief? And I would say it is justified. I do think that I can provide the proper epistemic support for that. And that is to say, let me put it this way. I can reason from my basal assumptions to the conclusion that the sun is hotter than snow. There's a justification, there's a path there. But then when I ask you about it, you kind of keep going back to this point, and obviously because that is your main point, you keep going to the point that, like, well, you can't even embark in that kind of reasoning. It has to be built upon adopting the Christian worldview as a base platform. And that's the thing I don't get. Let's get straight to that issue, because that's a thing that you've said a few times. I've heard you say it on other occasions, that's the one claim I just go, well, that's just not the case. It is not the case that I have to predicate any of my reasoning on adopting any portion of any Christian worldview in order to embark in reasoning. It has to be built on something, but it doesn't have to be built on the Christian worldview. Okay, then I would just say, go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish.
No, that's where I ended, literally, yeah.
Okay, then I was going to ask you, if that is the case, if you say that it's not the Christian God, if you're not borrowing from the Christian worldview in order to have a foundation or epistemological standpoint to say that science is reliable, then my question is, well, how do you know that science is indeed trustworthy and reliable if indeed we're just the random product of naturalistic evolution that's constantly changing our brain chemistry, changing our language, our speech from meaning one thing to something completely different the next.
Okay, well, that's sort of a lack of persistence in reality would be so just reality rending for me, right? The very idea that, like you say, that our words could just change, that things just, or how do we know that gravity's still going to exist tomorrow? Those kind of things would be reality rending for me. And the reason is because I start with, and whether it's my position, that this is how people reason, okay? That we I'm going to borrow Ozzy's wonderful expression for this. I don't know if he borrowed it from somebody, but there are a set of beliefs, these basal assumptions, basal presuppositions, that we drink in with our mother's milk, right? That as we're constructing our cognitive faculties, there are some beliefs that just kind of get built into the process. That's an unsatisfying explanation for them, but let's enumerate them first. So it's things like that there exists a mind-independent reality, right? That whether or not I'm aware of the number of molecules in Jupiter, there is a Jupiter out there. I might not even be aware of Jupiter. Heck, I might have been told about Jupiter and I don't believe it. I deny Jupiter exists, as some people do. But there is a mind independent reality. So that's one of my beliefs, that exists a mind independent reality. Another one of my beliefs is that there exist other minds in the world. I'm not just the one mind in the world, and I've invented you, for example, right? And I believe in the usefulness of deduction and the usefulness of induction. Those are the part of my basal beliefs. So you wanted to chime in on that point.
I wanted to chime in on when you said there's a mind-independent reality. What do you mean by mind-independent reality, if you can articulate that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean that there exists, I guess there are some things that would exist only if there are minds to contemplate them, right? So they're abstract things that if there weren't a mind, like the notion of justice, for example, you can't go find justice anywhere. Oh, that's a weird phrase. Where do I find justice? No, you know what I mean. Literally, justice is not something to be met with in the physical world. Boy, I'm borrowing the Aussie phrases left and right. I will, however, claim that Aussie is actually stealing my words. Aussie's just a big HogTie clone. But no, justice is not something to be met with in the physical world. If I put on a blindfold and walk into a forest, I'm going to meet with a tree in the physical world, but I'll never encounter justice by bumping into it. Justice is something that exists in a mind-dependent reality. So it's a concept that our minds construct. Then, but there are other things like, for example, the moon. The moon would exist, like let's say all life in the universe just for whatever reason just disappeared tomorrow, or let's go back to a point in time before there was any life in the universe. The moon was there. The moon's a thing, or the sun, right? These are things that exist, independent of our minds. We can have correct beliefs about them, or even hold incorrect beliefs about them, but they still exist. So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw between, concepts or abstractions versus a mind independent reality. And I do believe that there's a mind independent reality.
So essentially, you do believe there's an intelligence that's beyond us?
No, that's not necessary. I'm saying that there's a physical reality. There's a universe out there of some form. There's a universe out there that would exist even if I weren't thinking about it.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily mean that there's an intelligence out there. It may be an utterly unintelligent universe. In fact, that's my belief, is that the universe itself isn't an intelligent, thinking being with wishes and emotions.
Okay, so my next question to you would be, how exactly would you be able to how do you know that you're rightly perceiving and arriving at the proper concept that the universe exists? How do you know that this belief is indeed universally and objectively what we're looking for? When I say objectively, I mean that it is true, independent of us. It is a concept that is not just merely something we thought of, but it's a concept that really does have, what's what I'm looking for? I would say it is a concept that really does exist in a more grand, intelligent sense that it actually applies to us, like an absolute law of logic that exists out in the universe, or that is applicable to the universe as we perceive it. Or do you believe that essentially all of our logic and reason is just random brain chemistry that just evolved just right, or evolved to the point that it's right, that evolved to the point that is where it's at right now?
Well, first off, I certainly don't believe that any of our thoughts are a result of random brain chemistry. But I know what you mean. I'm going to admit to struggling a little bit with the last thing you were saying, as you were looking for words. Again, I'm never going to guess at what you mean. I'll just honestly admit I didn't quite get that. Actually, do you want to just take another run at it, because I feel a little bit lost to it? Go ahead and take another run at explaining your point or asking your question.
When I say that, when I'm talking about the idea of laws of logic and reason and truth, are you saying that for example, do you believe that laws of logic are indeed absolute and universally and objectively applicable, whether one person disagrees, whether someone likes it or agrees with it or not? Do you believe that?
I'm going to have to apologize in advance, because my issues about things about laws of logic and even things about laws of mathematics, I've discussed it quite a bit over in the Dragoon Discord server, and not much on CARM, so you might be unfamiliar with it. And I'm going to apologize in advance, because it's not as simple as you might think. So, that expression about always make things as simple as possible, but no more simple. I just want to warn you ahead of time. It's a little more complicated than that. There are some things, some conceptual things, that wouldn't exist if there weren't minds to establish them. So, for example, the game of chess, right? Or algebra, right? Just mathematics, right? These are things that arise because of the activities of minds. But once you've established a system, once you've established a framework to discuss these things, it may be a completely conceptual thing. It's something that it's concepts that are products of mind. Once you've established them, there are conclusions that then arise necessarily, right? So I'll give you an example that sort of has worked for me reasonably well in the past. If we're going to talk about triangles, right? We can make up, you and I can discuss triangles, right? So we're going to agree on what a definition of a triangle is. You have 3 points in space and line segments joining each pair of points. Necessarily, if you have 3 points in space, you necessarily have 3 pairs of points. So if the three, just for clarity, we say the points are A, B, and C. There's going to be a line segment going from A to B, and a line segment from B to C, and a line segment from C to A.
Yes.
So if we're going to talk about triangles, and that's the definition we agree on, it would be an objective fact that under those conceptual rules that we invented conceptually, that's our mind-dependent rules, we invented the definition of a triangle. It is necessarily true, it is objectively true that conditionally and within that set of rules, the triangle must have 3 sides. And there are other interesting facts that we would discover, that if you were going to measure the interior angles of that triangle, so we're going to define, a full turn as being 360 degrees. When you measure the internal angles of a triangle, you're going to get 180 degrees. That's just going to happen. And that's not a product of minds, right? That is an objective truth about triangles. But it's not, it would be incorrect to say that objective truth sort of floats around somewhere out there in the universe, or it's woven into the fabric of the universe. Because here's the comparison I want to make, and please let me know if this is successful, or if you're just like, I don't get what you're talking about. You sound like a crazy person, HogTie. Please be honest about it. So if what's happening is the universe is there. If there are no minds, then there are no triangles, there's no angles, there's none of these things that arise. But as soon as you get people who sit and they discuss and they talk about triangles and geometry and mathematics, these things all arise as a conceptual generation from these minds working. Then they can set about to work with these definitions, and they will discover things that are conditionally within that world, such as a triangle has to have 3 sides. A triangle has to have a sum of angles equal to 180 degrees. And it works like this. Compare it to the game of chess. If chess isn't objective, chess is not part of objective reality. Chess is a product of the enterprise of minds communicating with each other. Right? That's why we have chess. It's conceptual. But once you and I agree on the rules for chess, if you and I are playing chess, and in my second move, I move my third move, I move my queen out to where it's against your pawn row. So all you have to do is just move a pawn diagonally, and you take my queen. You are going to say to me, HogTie, that's a bad move. And I can say, well, is that just your subjective opinion? And you would rightly say, no, that is objectively a terrible, terrible move. Right? Now, how can it be objective? So what I'm saying is that once you construct that conceptual world, there are certain truths that flow from it necessarily, independent of your opinion. We can agree on the definitions of algebra, for example, and if one day you're doing a math problem and you tell me that it's your honest belief that 2 + 2 = 5, I'm going to tell you that you're objectively wrong. Within the rules, conventional rules of mathematics, 2 + 2 just has to equal 4. And if you believe differently, then you are just objectively wrong. So hopefully you get my point. You see, it's not as simple as some people like to go, it's this or that. I think that these things are all conceptual, but then once you've adopted those rules, so you asked about logic. So let me make the point that way. When you ask about the absolute laws, about the laws of logic, I believe that once minds set about to create systems of logical calculation, like Aristotelian logic, then there are some things that are necessarily true of those systems. But they're not necessarily true in all corners of the universe and just everywhere. The thing that's necessarily true is, if you adopt the rules of Aristotelian logic, then these certain things, these laws of logic follow. That's part of the system.
Okay, so my response to that would be this. Then how do you know that any particular conceptual world, as you put it, any conceptual world or conceptual establishment or foundational rules that help us build from there up have any correspondence to reality in and of itself? Would it be, if it's based upon merely agreement, then sometime in the future, those very foundational laws can be completely changed and you wouldn't have the means to try and say that they're right or wrong. You said that's just based upon a consensus, or as opposed to it's pretty much just based on how people feel one day or the next. That's essentially what's happening. So, and I think that's what Charles Darwin and Friedrich Nietzsche were trying to hint at, that when you remove God from the equation, do you have any foundations of up or down left? Do you not feel the breath of the little strain of infinite nothing? Because without God, you essentially lose all definitions of everything. And Dr. Ravi Zacharias made it very clear in one of his talks. He said a lot of atheists and of course good Christian theists have pointed out that once you remove God from the equation, everything in existence will literally have to be redefined.
Okay, now now we have now crossed the threshold into the stuff that I very much object to. And this is the stuff I would strive to show you why that kind of thinking isn't really helpful, because there's a real effort amongst pre-suppers, and you do it more respectfully than anybody else I've seen do it, but it's still misguided. And that's to say, hey, if I can show something that at least I perceive as a chink in the armor, something wrong with something you just said, then therefore everything's higgledy-piggledy and all akimbo and helter-skelter, and you don't know, cats could sprout 15 legs one day. Whoa, reality's just all upside down. And that is not at all a reasonable conclusion for some of the things that I'm saying here. So, for example, you make mention of the way you first put it was you'd asked, perhaps rhetorically, but you asked, well, how do you know if these rules can change? If these rules are a product of mind and they changed, how do you know that they match reality? Well, the answer is sometimes they match reality. Some systems match reality and some systems don't, or they only match certain parts of it. So, for example, I'm going to use a math example here. You and I agree that 12 plus 1. Sorry, I'm going to mess this up. You and I agree. Let's do it this way. 11 plus 2 = 1, right? We agreed on that, right? 11 plus 2 = 1.
11 plus 2?
Yeah, 11 plus 2 = 1. This is not a non-contentious point. You're going to agree with this. 11 plus 2 = 1, right?
I would say no. 11 plus 2 = 13.
Oh, no, because there's no 13. There is no 13. Now, what I'm getting at here is that we'd message each other approximately 11:30. Let's just make the example more simple. Let's say it was 11 o'clock. So we messaged each other at 11 o'clock, and we agreed that we would start in 2 hours. And I know that's actually not the details of our original communication, but I just try to make the numbers work. If you messaged me at 11 and said, well, hey, we can do this in 2 hours, I'm going to say, well, 11 plus 2 = 1. Yeah, I'm free at 1. And we've now agreed we're going to meet at 1, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's a system of math. That's the mathematics, sometimes called clock arithmetic, or the integers modulo. That's a system of math that is very, very useful in its application to mapping out times of day on a world that turns at the speed that it turns. And it makes it an effective way we can communicate. Conceptually, you understand how clocks work. Obviously I was sort of doing that was like a mini trap. It wasn't a real, but where I'm saying like, oh, well, obviously 11 plus 2 = 1. Well, now as soon as I pointed, I'm talking about the clock, you immediately went, oh, that, yeah, of course. But if I told you that, if you have 11 sheep and I'm going to sell you 2 more sheep, and then when you show up at your field, you have 1, I'm going to say, but I thought we agreed that 11 plus 2 equals 1. You're going to say, well, no, that's not how you count sheep. So all of these systems, whether it's mathematics, different fields of mathematics, or in logical reasoning, they're all systems that are built to be internally consistent. And it turns out some of them have a very, very useful application in solving problems about reality, right? So for example, that thing with the triangle that we were talking about, if you're a carpenter and you need to cut some angles for a gable, it's very, very handy to know that those internal angles have to add up to 180 degrees. You simply can't get away from that. But if you're navigating a ship on the surface of the earth, then that property doesn't work anymore. You have to have a different model for what you consider a quote unquote triangle. It's a different thing. And it's the same thing with logic. So this idea that, oh, well, we can, I think the way you put it was, well, we can just change these rules at whim. It depends what mood you're in and that sort of thing. That is an effort, I would say a very transparent effort to try to make the other person's position look just silly, just plain silly. That's essentially what you're telling me is when I say, well, look, sometimes you use this type of math to solve this problem, but a different type of math will be used to solve this other problem. And each of these different systems of math or different systems of logic, they have different rules. If you then respond to me to say, oh, well, gee, HogTie, if you guys can just change the rules, if a mind can change the rules willy-nilly, well, then we could have cats living on the moon. It's all crazy. Do you see my objection to that sort of criticism?
Well, the fact of the matter is, I would say, when you're saying certain systems actually work, I would say they work by virtue of how God made the universe. I would still fall upon that presupposition. And I would say we're able to rightly make that conclusion by virtue of God's revelation, God's natural creation. We're able to rightly perceive that through revelation. And I would say even the atheist or the unbeliever is able to rightly perceive that, even if they reject the God of the Bible. They're still able to rightly understand these realities. I'm not saying they cannot understand these realities at all, but I'm saying you don't have the justification for the person who suddenly wants to be all willy-nilly with the rules of logic and reason. It's like you don't have any response to tell them they're wrong, apart from still trying to borrow from the more philosophical foundations of the biblical worldview.
Okay. Well, I don't think that's necessary. I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't necessarily exist. Okay. So let me give you some ground here, because you're right about this. I mean, I can say that, well, look, we can create a system and we're going to call it algebra, and it's going to have neat things like as we play with it, we're going to learn that things like 11 plus 2 equals 13. And when I have 11 sheep and then you sell me 2 more sheep, well, now I have 13 sheep. Hey, that's really handy. So the question isn't, well, why does algebra work in solving certain types of problems? The question is, when algebra is built to be consistent, why is the world consistent? Why is reality consistent? Why is it today that 11 sheep plus 2 sheep equals 13 sheep, and tomorrow 11 sheep plus 2 more sheep is still 13 sheep, and just forever? That seems to be something built into the universe. That's fascinating. And if we're going to try to offer an explanation for that, I can't necessarily answer a question, why is the universe consistent in that way? That is, we're not talking about the consistency of algebra. We're not talking about the consistency of logic. We're talking about the consistency of the actual mind-independent reality that things like algebra and logic endeavor to model. So let's set aside algebra and logic. I mean, algebra and logic are constructs. They're inventions of minds. So they are whatever people want them to be. The real question is underlying why is it that they are able to map that regularity that exists in the real world? Why is the real world regular? You immediately have an answer for that, right? You immediately say, well, because the Christian God made it that way. Right. And I'm saying that's an unnecessary step. My view is, well, yes, that appears to be a property of reality, like that reality has certain regularities to it. And that is just a feature of this mind-independent reality. If you ask me, why does this mind-independent reality have this feature? I'm going to shrug my shoulders and say, I don't know. Well, a lot of times when people ask why, they're really asking how. How does reality exist in a way that has such regularities? Why? What's the purpose of these regularities? I don't have answers to either of those questions. But that does not in any way hinder my ability to do reasoning about this world. I believe that there are regularities in the real world. I don't have an explanation for it, but I believe they're there. And because of my belief in those regularities, if they're true, I can do all this sorts of reasoning. Now, when I ask you, well, what's your explanation for it? You say, I'm going to be unkind when I say this. You say, 'cause God. But I'm going to tell you, there's two problems with saying "cause God." You please go ahead and interject, and I'll get back to that. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say again, we as Bible believing Christians are not saying that atheists and agnostics and unbelievers cannot reason that algebra works the way it does, or mathematics works the way it does, or even logic and reason works the way it does. We're not saying you cannot know that. We're saying you cannot possibly define how or the justification for why it is there, and to even say that God is unnecessary. It begs the question: well, how do you know that God is? How do you know that God is simply unnecessary? What's what I'm looking for? What is the step or the rule by which you're able to say, oh no, God's just not necessary? It's like why are you somehow wanting to say, okay, algebra works this way, or logic works this way, or truth and objectivity and philosophy works this way, but we don't need to call upon God. We don't have to take that extra step.
Oh, because as long as you accept that it's true, right? I mean, just as an example, like if we were in a room and there's a time bomb in the middle of the room and we're watching the counter count down. Mm-hmm. We're going to say, you know what? I'm going to do some reasoning here. I'm going to reason we ought to GTFO and not be in this room anymore. And you're going to come to the same conclusion. Neither one of us so far in the story has an account for how that bomb got there. Right? Or to put a more happy example, if we go somewhere and we're hungry, we're walking through the forest and we find a fruit-bearing tree. Right? We might not know that tree was actually transplanted from somewhere else and planted in this forest, unlike the other trees, and it manages to thrive there and it feeds us. It doesn't matter what the explanation is. Initially, we can say, well, we can reason about that bit of reality. Now, I want to tell you the two problems you have with when you say, well, that you don't see how the Christian God is unnecessary in that reasoning. Here are the two problems you have. So at first, I have to put my problems on the table. It's the only way it'll make sense. I say, I believe it's these regular, I'm just for brevity, I'm going to say these regularities. We're talking about all sorts of majestic things about the universe. These regularities are part of reality. I believe it, you believe it. If you ask me how they're part of reality or why they're part of reality, I'm going to say, I don't know. I don't know. Your answer is going to be, well, because God. And I'm going to tell you, here are two problems with that. You still suffer the how. You did not answer the how or why problem. How does God make a universe that has regularity? Why does God make a universe with regularity? You may have some guidance on the why question because of scriptural support for God's intent, but it actually doesn't help you understand the universe any better. Mechanistically, it doesn't give you any leg up on understanding how the universe works. So we still have that belief that the universe exists in a fashion that has these regularities, but you're adding on this extra thing. You're saying not only is there this universe that exists with these regularities, and I have no idea how it comes to be with these regularities, but also I believe in this God thing that explains it, which it doesn't explain it. But now you've got this unexplained God thing hanging off the end of your pile of presuppositions. And it always baffles me that presuppositionalists don't see that as a problem. They somehow see it as a solution. It's not a solution. It doesn't solve. Let me word it this way. Not only is that not a solution to the how question, it is an additional problem. You don't have any better solution for the how question than I do. But you bring in the guise of a solution, you bring in another problem. You now have something else unexplained.
Well, the fact of the matter is I would disagree because now, of course, we don't have the exhaustive explanation of God. Otherwise, this whole world would literally be stacked with books. But because by virtue of who God is based upon what the Bible teaches. But I would say in regards to that, I would say we do indeed solve the question. We do make it very clear that there is a lawgiver, an intelligent mind that has established the universe to be the way that it is by virtue of his nature, his consistent eternal character and being. And we have that revealed in the scripture. So we are able to solve the problem. Now, if you're talking about like all the scientific mechanisms and all the chemicals or all the sort of things that God was doing, we don't have all the ins and outs, the scientific ins and outs of what God was doing, but we do understand that foundationally, God's miraculous, otherworldly power and omnipotence, brought the universe. And of course, it's through his omniscience and omnipotence, God brought the universe as we know it today. And of course, by virtue of who he is, and well, laws, when it comes down to like laws and mathematics, these things have always been in the mind of God, and due to his character and nature. But As a matter of fact, I think maybe if I send you a video, it might help you a little bit. Let me look it up.
Okay, well, let me then reiterate why I think that's not a solution. Because if you ask me how or why, so again, for brevity, we're saying the regularities of the universe. We both believe in a universe that has regularities to it. And it may have other properties, but just to not retread that over and over again, I'm just going to use that expression. So I say the universe has these properties. You say the universe has these properties, and I'm saying neither one of us know how. If you ask me how, I'm going to say, well, that's the character of the universe. That's the nature and character of the universe. You know, there's time and there's gravity and there's, you know, stuff, right? That's the nature of the universe. And you say, oh, but HogTie, I have an answer for this because God made the universe that way. I say, okay, well, then how did God make it that way? Your answer is, well, it's a character, nature and character of God. So you actually only kick the can down the road a very short distance. I don't understand how the universe has this nature and character. You say it has the nature and character because it reflects the nature and character of God. But then how why God, nature, character, right? It does not answer the question even slightly. In fact, it creates a whole other unanswerable questions. Plus, thank you, Aries, for reminding me of the point that I missed in my last rant on the microphone, was that now do you not only have something tacked onto the end that you can't explain, you have something tacked onto the end that you can't provide any support for, you can't justify, right? Why the Christian God? Why does it have to be the Christian God? You provide no support for that. And as an illustration of what it sounds like when somebody says, look, we don't know why the universe is like this. And then somebody walks up and says, oh, because Christian God. That's the nature and the character of the Christian God. And we would turn and look sideways and go, what? Why do you think that? Let me illustrate it this way. Let's suppose you and I live near the ocean and we notice that there's like high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide. And it's clearly on a daily cycle. But that daily cycle itself shifts over a month. What is going on? Why is it like this? And you say, look, I don't know why. The tide's just part of the character of the ocean. For some reason, that's why the oceans do that. I don't know the reason. And I say, well, I do know the reason. It's because that rock that's on the beach up over there, that's a slightly different color than the other rocks, that rock is the cause of the tides going up and down. And you say, how does that happen? I say, well, that's the character of the rock. The nature and character of the rock is it is the tide-making rock. Well, how does it do it? I don't know. That's just the nature and character of the rock. It's the tide-making rock. A third person is going to come up to us and say, lift your heads, dummies. There's that big rock out there in space. That's the tide-making rock, right? But let's make this illustration even better. When I point up the beach to my tide-making rock, there's no tide-making rock there. I say, oh, there's a tide-making rock there, but you can't see it. So the three people in this scenario are one person who says, I don't know. It's just the general character of the oceans that they have tides. Then we've got me who says, well, the reason it has that character is because there's a tide-making rock over there that we can't see. And that's because of its nature and character. That's the cause of tides.
Okay, I think I know.
I'm not explaining it any better than you because I've just invented a thing that has a nature and character that causes the nature and character of the thing that we actually observe. And I can't even demonstrate to you that that particular rock even exists, let alone if it did exist, that it would actually have the character of being able to produce tides. Okay, that's what it sounds like to me when you say Christian God causes universe regularities.
Okay, I think I know what you're hinting at. You're pretty much saying if it's not essentially manifested in the material world, then if it's not materialistic or physical, then we cannot know what it is. But that's, again, we run into the same problem we still run into the same problems with the concept of laws and logic and reason in mathematics, because in order for these laws to have any real any sense of concrete reality, as it were, and I'm not just talking about merely conventions, I'm talking about an actual universal eternal application, they would have to be something beyond us. So Otherwise, you're going to constantly be begging the question of how long is it going to continue to hold up until it finally changes, until the very foundation of laws of logic and reason and mathematics and education even change. But also to respond to the idea that just because God is non-physical, meaning just because we can't see him means he doesn't exist. Well, the fact of the matter is, I would agree with what Matt Slick here is saying. Different kinds of claims require, different kinds of claims require different kinds of evidence. Hopefully I'm not misquoting him on that. But that's essentially what we come down to. Because we say God is spirit, he's a non-corporeal being, he's a non-physical being, there is a different kind of way that a person can encounter him, and that's through through his word, and of course through revelation, through indeed seeking him and finding him in the spiritual sense. So when we're saying that God is non-physical, or God indeed created the universe, we are talking about a spiritual entity. We're not talking about a physical being apart from the physical body of Christ, but we're talking about God in the more totality sense, like, you know, his omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. So his spiritual, non-physical godness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Although, to be fair to myself here, you're actually answering an objection that I wasn't raising. I'm not saying that. At no point am I saying or even intending to imply the problem with God as an explanation is that God is non-physical. Right. That is not at all my objection. My objection is that it is an idea. The idea of there being a creator God is a concept that doesn't appear to map onto reality at all. That it's just something that doesn't exist. Like I use the example of there being a rock down the beach that's the tide causing rock, but I can't even prove to you that the rock, well, I mean, you can look at a couple different scenarios. Suppose you look and you're like, I don't see that rock you're talking about. You said there's a different colored rock, an orange rock, whatever. I just don't see it. Like, what are you talking about? So, well, take my word for it. It's there. The rock has revealed itself to me. Well, look at the tides. How the heck the tides happen? That's obvious proof that the tide causing rock exists, right? So, or I might create a spirit. My criticism is completely independent of the physicality or spirituality or anything else to do with what you're purporting to be the cause of the general character of the universe. Okay, right? Or I could go pick up a physical rock and say, well, here's the rock that causes the tides. You're going to say, okay, HogTie, you convinced me. I'm a believer now. That is indeed a rock. I believe the rock exists. Now prove to me that that's the tide causing rock. And I'm saying that you're by tacking on the God onto your epistemology, you're creating two separate problems. One, you can't prove you don't have a, I shouldn't say you can't prove it. You don't have a rational justification for believing that this God even exists. And even if you accept it on faith, you don't have a rational justification for saying that God is the cause of the universe. And yet it's your repeated assertion that God is necessary, that the Christian God is necessary. And I don't think you can carry that ball either.
Well, the fact, but to respond to what you're saying, when you're talking about this rock, we understand rocks to be, we understand rocks to be physical properties, to be a physical object. And when it comes down to God, by virtue of the fact of how God has indeed revealed himself in Scripture, we do have the testimony of people who have encountered him, who've come to know him. And the very God who testifies of who he is from Genesis all the way to Revelation, we have the testimonies right there in the Bible. We have the evidence that not only does God exist, but certainly that he has spoken, and we are required to turn to him, to his son, Jesus Christ, in saving faith. So the idea that, we can't even demonstrate that he exists is simply nonsense. We have the evidence right there. Now, whether or not you accept it, that's up to you. But let me put it this way: to savingly accept it is up to you. But of course, the knowledge is still there for every individual human being, that God does indeed exist.
Yeah. Well, that ironically, you just said a thing that just strikes me so ironic, because remember your earlier criticism of my position. You're kind of using my position as an exemplar of other non-believers. Is that, if you don't have a justification for these things, then reality's all higgledy-piggledy. Like you can't know for certain that gravity won't all of a sudden turn into a push instead of a pull tomorrow, or the world's all crazy. And yet the thing that you just said about evidence and saying, well, I can give you the evidence, but you can believe this or you can believe that. Some people accept it, some people won't accept it. Is the watering down, the dismissal of the fruits of rational thinking, right? To say that, well, there's evidence. Yeah, there's evidence. I mean, you're not going to believe the evidence, and that's your choice to not believe the evidence, or it's my choice to believe it, or someone else's choice to whatever. That is higgledy-piggledy thinking. That sort of thing of saying, well, there's evidence one way or another, and you're free to just say, oh, well, my conclusion is therefore God exists, and another person's conclusion is that he doesn't. Well, like to me, that is, I'm just going to repeat the phrase because I think it sort of captures it nicely, is that to me, that is the higgledy-piggledy thinking and a simple dismissal of the fruits of rational justification for your beliefs.
Okay, how do you define rational? When you say rational, are you talking about laws of logic that are universally and objectively and eternally applicable, or rules that are just conventions of the mind, meaning we just somehow came together and made a consensus of certain laws of logic that we somehow just agreed upon, but have that's essentially what you run into. You run into the problem of saying, when it comes down to your worldview, that when you say rational thinking, you're automatically assuming laws of logic and reason that essentially hold up whether one believes in it or not. But the problem that you're still going to arrive at is if it's merely a consensus or a convention of human thinking and evolution from the goo to you, then how do you know that those same laws of logic and reason have any real application to nature or reality as we perceive it?
Well, I can provide the justification for that. I mean, I'm wondering when you say, how do you know that these rules are consistent or they'll continue to have application? I'm wondering if you're attempting to ask me, how do you know for certain?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, then, because that question, how do you know for certain, ends up degenerating into one of the most vacuous conversational contributions ever. And I'm going to be harsh on that point because I think it's a genuinely silly thing to say. I know, and by the way, I want to be real clear about this, because if you were a jerk, I would be happy to say, that's a silly thing to say and you're silly for saying it. But you're such a nice guy, I have to take care, I have to take pains to make sure that I'm saying that's a silly thing to say. And I'm not thinking ill of you because you said it, but I do want to illustrate why it's silly. Because you can throw that question out there anytime. I could say anything. The sun is hotter than snow. Well, how do you know that for certain? I am certain. I certainly feel a sense of certainty. My subjective confidence is very, 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 very high. But how do I know for certain? My answer is going to be, I don't know, because I could be, who knows, I could be a brain in a vat, right? I mean, once you start getting into that extreme skepticism, then you completely unseat any effort towards rationality. And I say it's kind of conversation not very useful.
Okay.
But having said that, let me just really quickly give you the justification. So just to remind you that for using logic, is I do believe it's one of my basal assumptions that there exists a mind-independent reality about which we can learn things through our senses, somewhat imperfectly. I believe that there's general reliability of my memory that's somewhat imperfect. I believe there are other minds that are also imperfect, comparable to my level of imperfection, right? So those basal assumptions taken together help us devise things like systems of logical thinking. And when we make observations about the world, we do see these reliabilities. By the way, not everything is reliable all the time. There are changes. So it's not even your whole idea. You keep asking me, well, how do you know anything if these things can change? The universe itself is changing in character. So the idea that we would somehow lose all of our ability to reason if we're unconvinced that the universe simply can't change, that's silly for several reasons. Because the universe does change. And all that's necessary for us to reason is some local uniformity. I apologize. You were going to respond to my earlier point. I know that second thing sounded off topic. We'll get back to it. Go ahead.
No, but I would have to agree with Sergeant Bruggen when he said I try to stay away from the word basal assumptions, because that sounds more of the atheistic agnostic term. Because when we're talking about assumptions or presuppositions, I as a Christian approach this as to more when you come to the realm of certainty, and you're making a lot of, when you say you don't like the word certainty, or when you say the word certainty is silly, you're still saying this with absolute certainty, and you're still calling upon an absoluteness or a sense of certainty to that very statement that certainty is not a good word to use, or it's a silly word to use.
No, that's necessary. That's not necessary, because my objection to the use of the word certainty in that sense, when somebody says that you can't really know something unless you know it for certain, I think that's an epistemologically juvenile statement, right? Because and the thing is, when I make a claim like that, when I say, look, it doesn't, because it can be said of anything. That's the phrase I might use is that can be said of anything, right? Cats have 4 legs. Well, are you certain of that? Well, I'm very confident about it, but how do you have justified certainty in it? I can say, well, I don't know, maybe I'm a brain in a vat. I don't know, right? Like nothing. There's no things like that you would have your justified certainty regarding. Now, when I say that, and then you point out, oh, but that's an absolute statement. I mean, are you certain about that? I say, oh, I don't know. Right now, your accusation is that I'm saying you can't make those kind of statements. And then you say, but that statement itself is one of those statements. That's a Seitan-Brutenkate trick, and is very, very poorly misplaced. When he tried that on me, he didn't get very far with it, because he says, oh, well, is that absolutely true? And I say, well, it's just as true as the first thing I said. He goes, no. And he just took the position as if I was insisting that that's absolutely true. And the thing is, if so, anyway, I want to keep myself grounded here in what you were saying. If your criticism of my point is that I'm making an absolute statement by saying it's silly to rely on absolute certainty as a basis, as a yardstick for your knowledge, I'm saying I'm not even declaring that statement as being absolutely true. Is it silly to say, are you absolutely certain of this claim? How can you be absolutely certain of this claim? I say, yes, that is silly. If you say, well, is that claim absolutely certain? I'll say, I don't know, maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Because as I said before, that can be said of any claim.
Well, again, we still run into the same problem with every single claim that you're making. And I would agree with Sachin William K when he uses that, because it's not a trick. It's literally calling upon these laws of logic and reason, which do uphold and which do correspond to reality as we perceive it. We're not saying that a person's sense and reasoning necessarily is faulty. We're saying, what is the foundation? What is the means by which you're able to say that your reasonings are reliable? Or what is that foundational means by which you're able to say, okay, to use the argument of, to use the term certain or absolute is silly. You have to establish an absolute or an absolute objective, universally and eternally applicable standard, or eternally upholding standard by which you're able to say, okay, let's say for example, somebody has schizophrenia and they were insane. Their words were not the way that they behaved was not necessarily reliable, or their frame of thinking or their particular brain process is not completely trustworthy. Well, what is that foundational means by which you're able to say the person with schizophrenia or split personality disorder or dementia or Alzheimer's,
or a normal person dreaming, any of those things? Yeah, these are famous intractable problems, by the way. So for example, prove to me, or heck, even prove to yourself, that you're not dreaming right now. Maybe it's 3:30 in the morning where you are, and you are sound asleep and you're in a deep dream. Prove to yourself that that's not the case.
Well, I don't have to. I had the foundational. I had the absolute objective means by which I'm able to say I am indeed wide awake. I am conscious. I am awake and about, out and about.
So you never have dreams?
Of course, I have dreams, and I'll admit there have been some dreams that seemed really real. But once I woke up in reality, I was able to rightly perceive that I'm wide awake.
Right. Well, if you are awake now, then you are correct in your belief that you're awake. But if you're having a dream right now, and in your dream, you're dreaming that you're awake, then you're mistaken in your belief that you're awake right now. How do you tell the difference?
Well, again, we have the foundational means by which we're able to decipher that through our senses and our reasoning. Now, there are some dreams which seem convincing, but again, once we wake up, or once there's always that sense, and every human being does have it. What is that particular sense that they're dreaming? I don't know. I'll admit up front, I'm not sure what is that sense. But even in the dreams that seem the most real, there's always that sense that we're not quite awake. And
not in the dream.
I would argue that from more of the subjective perspective. I'll argue that. I'm not sure necessarily if I can call on any particular passage of scripture to sort of cut through that, make that dividing line. But I will say based upon more personal subjective experience, I would argue that's possibly that deep sense that every human being has, that they're still asleep, or they're still dreaming. But once they're wide awake, we're able to indeed objectively perceive without any reasonable doubt that we are wide awake.
Yeah. Well, so your answer then is, once you wake up from a dream, you then become aware that when you earlier had believed that you were awake, you weren't awake, you were actually asleep. Right. But that still means that when you were asleep and you in a dream and you dreamt that you were awake, that was a mistaken belief.
But again, I was saying, in that dream, even in that dream that I thought I was awake, there's always still that deeper sense that I'm not quite awake yet.
No, I mean, you can pick any of these examples with a schizophrenic patient, and honestly, this is a famous intractable problem from first year philosophy courses, right? And I'll tell you. I mean, you seem to dispute it now, but I'll tell you that the consensus on this is, anybody who's sort of gone through this thought experiment, is that it's easy to prove, actually. Maybe I'll just lay out the proof for you. It's demonstrable. This is a demonstrably intractable problem, because if it is the case that a dream state is one in which you imagine things to be true, whether they're true or not. I think that's a fair description of a dream state. You know, have you ever had a dream where you were flying before? And it just seems perfectly normal when you're flying. Sometimes partway through the dream, you start going, wait a second, I can't fly. And then your brain goes all weird and then you wake up, right? But before that moment, before the moment that you realize you're dreaming, in the dream, you hold confidently the mistaken belief that you're awake. So the challenge is, come up with, okay, what observations would you make to prove that you're awake and not dreaming? And the answer is that there's no such thing, because anything that your mind can generate now as convincing evidence to your own mind that you're actually awake right now is something that your own mind can invent in a dream. So that's why I say it's a famously intractable problem. Whatever your mind can think of right now as a way of proving that you're awake is something that your mind can think of while it's dreaming as a means to prove that you're awake when you're really not awake. This is a famously intractable problem. And I'll tell you honestly, the whole Seitan-Bruenkate thing is this is generally my criticism of it when I say that it's a bad apologetic. I mean, it's bad. It's sort of presented in this weird camp. So let me say it this way. Let me just. I kind of want to sort of let's move the conversation this way a little bit, because I've always kind of wanted to show you why I think this is a bad apologetic. So you have Christian apologetics, and then you have the studies of philosophy, including epistemology, morality, and a whole host of other things. Then you've got this weird sort of Seitan-Bruenkate popularized presuppositional apologetics. It's got one foot in apologetics and one foot in philosophy. Except it has one foot in neither. It is neither apologetics nor is it philosophy. It's bad apologetics. It's bad philosophy, because I'm going to make this point, and then I'm certainly welcome to respond to it. It is a one-trick pony. The one trick comes in varied forms, but there's only one thing that it does: is it looks at these very sophomoric. I mean, they're important problems, but they're things that you take in first-year philosophy. These sophomoric problems prove that there exist other minds. Prove that you're not just a brain in a vat. Prove that you're awake right now and not in fact dreaming. Prove that you don't have delusional schizophrenia. And students sit and they go, oh, this is easy. Hey, wait a second, it's not easy, it's really hard. And then they come to learn that it's actually impossible. These are famously intractable problems. Seitan-Bruenkate sifts through and he finds these little sophomoric toy problems that people learn in first year of a philosophy class. And he says, well, here's what I'm going to do. I can't prove, this is my take on Seitan-Bruenkate apologetics. You ready? And this is the thing I want you to respond to. Seitan-Bruenkate says, damn, I really want to show people that I'm not a dummy for believing in God, so I wanted to support my position. It turns out I have no support for my position in believing in God, except for the typical, oh, it's in the Bible, and you've got to have enough faith, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's what I'm going to do instead of proving my position. I'm going to find an atheist, and I'm going to show them how they have flaws in their worldview. I'm then going to use those flaws as a declaration that their worldview is wrong. Therefore, miracle happens, my worldview is correct. So his entire apologetic, if you even want to call it that, is based on taking out a little toy problem that every first-year philosophy student learns and takes it to an uninitiated atheist and says, hey, atheist, prove to me that you're not in a dream. Hey, atheist, prove to me that your foundations for your reasoning are true. And the atheist is going to stammer and stumble and mess it up in every way that every first-year philosophy student does. And Seitan-Bruenkate is going to say, well, that's where you're wrong. Therefore, repent your sins and turn to God. And that method is effective on no one. It's bad philosophy and it's abysmal apologetics. I invite your response to that.
Okay, my response is this. The idea that, okay, let me just point out, the flaws in your worldview. I mean, yes, by all means, as a Christian, as a presuppositionalist, I do believe that essentially, because of the flaws of non-Christian perspectives, the fact of the matter, I would say, by virtue of the revelation of what God gives in the Bible, we're able to point out that these flaws are there because they're not grounded in the person of Jesus Christ. And the Christians are able to have a holistic, a wholehearted, and dare I say, airtight, sealed apologetic by virtue of the fact that God has revealed himself, that we have the evidence right there in the Bible. Now, when we say, indeed, put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, we're not talking about fideism. We're talking about the Greek word pistis, which means an apprehension or a grasp or an understanding, or what's we're looking for, a trustworthiness in the information that is given, a sense of trust, having a good sense of, or good confidence, dare I say, a proper objective confidence, or a confidence in what is objectively revealed or perceivable And that's what we have in the very revelation of Scripture itself, in the person of the God of Scripture, ultimately revealed in Jesus Christ. And that's what we have. We're not saying let's just put a whole bunch of flaws in people's worldview. I do think that is one of the main things that must be done. However, we're able to point out the reason these flaws exist is because mankind everywhere must necessarily borrow from the God of the Bible and reject the God of the Bible, all because of essentially they want to live life apart from him. And it's with the Christian gospel message and the person of Jesus Christ and the demonstration of what the Bible teaches in Scripture that every human being, Christian and non-Christian alike, must rely upon the very foundation and God of who God is in his nature and character in order to properly use logic and reason, mathematics, and what have you.
Well, you say that. You say that as a repeated assertion, and that's what it comes down to, is the assertion that, well, these things would exist only if the Christian God exists. You have no support for that claim. And let me respond to a couple of points that you said in there that hopefully will illustrate why this is not a sound apologetic. And also there's a way that I would argue that it's a bad or ineffective apologetic. But I want to pick up a couple of phrases. At one point, actually a couple of points, you said that, well, it's not just that I'm trying to point out flaws in your worldview. Of course, your worldview is flawed. And then you once refer to it as wrong. And a worldview having a flaw or an inadequacy doesn't mean that it is wrong in its entirety. I'm sure you would agree with that. But you then, referring to your own worldview, said, dare I say, you use this phrase, you wanted to use the phrase airtight seal of epistemology, right? You want to use that expression airtight seal. It is unassailable. I've heard, so Brojo use the term, Dede often uses the phrase, it's a knockdown argument. And I can't remember what phrase Brojo uses, but there's a lot of these phrases. It's a knockdown argument. It's an airtight argument. It's just nothing you can say to beat it. Well, that's a declaration. Let's trot out the argument. Then we can see if there's actually an airtight seal or it's a knockdown thing. And you said it in a sort of way like, well, dare I say, like an airtight seal of epistemology. No. We'd actually have to hear what the argument is to assess whether or not it is something undefeatable. Because the thing that you said, I want to talk about flaws and failures. Okay, you said your worldview has flaws. Another occasion you said your worldview fails because of the absence of the Christian God in your worldview. Yeah. My worldview doesn't fail. What does it mean to say that a worldview fails? My worldview succeeds in many ways. I'm sure that there are mistakes in my worldview. There are certainly lots of gaps in my worldview. There's foundations that I can't provide justification for. There's beliefs that I simply don't have an opinion on because I don't have enough information. And there are even some beliefs that don't agree with reality. And if you look hard enough, I probably even have some beliefs that don't match other beliefs, that are inconsistent with my other beliefs. So my worldview has internal inconsistencies. It has missing information, just absent beliefs. And my worldview has beliefs that don't comport with reality. And my worldview is absent a lot of support. But here's the problem. Here's the problem, Baptist. You sitting down for this? All those things I just said about my worldview are true of your worldview. Your worldview has beliefs in it that do not comport with reality. Your worldview has internal inconsistencies where one belief is in conflict with another belief.
Such as?
Your worldview has, well, let's get to the interesting one. You cannot provide a justification for the foundation of your worldview. This is a big thing. This is a big thing. Let me say it clearly, and then you can pick at the parts that you're not getting what I'm saying, or that I'm not being clear. One of the criticisms of the so-called, when presuppers talk to atheists, they'll say, well, you can't provide a justification for your beliefs. So actually, a moment ago, you'd even asked for something about, you have to have a foundation. I've said repeatedly my foundation. I accept what people often identify as the properly basic beliefs. Those things that are drunk in with your mother's milk, such as that exists a mind-independent reality about which we can reason somewhat effectively, that I have memory that is generally speaking reliable, that I have senses that help me with some general reliability learn about the universe around me. Those are beliefs that I have. They're incorrigible. I can't even change those beliefs. I can't even imagine how I would think, well, suppose there isn't a mind-independent reality. I don't even know how to think now. Those are intractable basal assumptions, or people call them properly basic beliefs. Now, can I justify them? Do I have a rational basis for believing them? I can't provide a justification for my foundation, but every time that you've suggested that I have to give you my foundation, I'm going to say I have repeated it several times. If you want a justification for my foundation, that's a slightly different question. But my point is here to you is that if you would point out my inability to provide a justification for my foundational beliefs, if you say, well, that makes your worldview fail, I'm going to say you got two problems there, Baptist. Number one, that doesn't make my worldview fail. It's just an inadequacy in my worldview. But the second problem is more interesting. You have the same flaw in your worldview. You cannot provide a justification for your basal assumptions. Does that mean that your worldview fails?
I would say, my response to that would simply be this: I do have the justification in the fact that God has revealed himself through the Bible. The fact that people have indeed encountered this God, and I myself, not necessarily in the sense to where I received that blinding white light from heaven, but in the sense to where I have indeed seen God reveal himself in the scriptures and have reached that I'll admit, a supernatural encounter with him through his word and ultimately through trusting in Christ myself. So I would argue that this is not, when we're talking about encountering God, we're not talking about a physical encounter. We are talking about something spiritual, something that indeed must take place that's outside of physical barriers or physical, something that must take place that's beyond the physical realm. So I'll admit that Christianity is a supernatural faith, but it's not a faith in something that doesn't exist. It's a faith that's something that's simply outside of our physical perception, in the sense of encountering God himself, something that must be beyond us.
Okay, but all of those experiences you're describing, both revelation through God's word, through just nature being what it is, God speaks volumes through that, and then a very separate category, one that, by the way, I'm going to say I find really, really interesting. This is the one I find the most compelling, are those personal interactions, those spiritual interactions. That to me is very compelling evidence in supporting a Christian God. So you want to bookmark that, because I think we have a fascinating discussion about that. But I want to point out that all those things you listed hinge entirely on you believing there exists a mind-independent reality, believing that there are other minds in the world, believing that you have memory that is generally reliable, believing that you have senses so that you can collect generally reliable information about this mind-independent reality. That is to say, you have to borrow, if not borrow, wholesale ransack my stated worldview before you can even start to think about the Christian God, before you can experience any of the revelation. You have to first off absolutely ransack and pirate every element of my stated worldview before you can even start towards reasoning about God.
Okay, I think I see what you're trying to hint at, but my response to that would simply be no. Well, now, why do I say that? Is because when one person does indeed encounter the Christian God, we understand that we have always, from the very beginning, been borrowing from God himself, who is the very beginning and the ending, who is the first and the last, who is ultimately revealed in Jesus Christ, who made it very clear that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He's the very source of logic and truth and reason in and of itself, and we've been constantly borrowing from him the very creation, the very being made in the Imago Dei from the very beginning. So all of our logic and reasoning that even led us or even helped us to understand or perceive the God of the Bible has been borrowed from him from the very beginning. That's what God reveals to us through that supernatural encounter.
Well, again, sorry, I thought you were done.
No, I was going to say that's pretty much that's the conclusion we inevitably come to whenever a person comes to true and saving faith in Jesus Christ.
Right, but then it's a conclusion. It's not an assumption. One of the big flaws, I will say, in presuppositional apologetics is that nothing in that set of things that are listed as the presuppositions are actually presuppositions. They're all conclusions, right? So the idea that everything that you just described about encountering reality, encountering, nature and its beauty, and reading the Bible and having supernatural experiences with God, these are all things that lead a person to the conclusion that God is real. There is nothing presuppositional about it. That's one of the things that had always baffled me in the early days of presupapologetics, is they say, well, we're not going to prove God to you. First, we're going to presume God, right? And then you describe this process, which is entirely derivative. It is entirely saying, I am going to start with you don't say this out loud, but this is what you're doing, is you're saying, without stating it, I'm going to start with all of the properly basic beliefs, and from there I'm going to encounter the world, and I'm going to come to the conclusion that God is real and he has a plan for me. and that I ought to repent my sins. But then after the fact, I'm going to claim that I presumed God. I've never seen anyone do that. You guys always start your discussions with claiming that it's a presupposition, and then you describe a process which is entirely reasoning starting from the properly basic beliefs and reasoning to your conclusion that God exists and he has a plan for you.
Okay, that might have been my own mistake when I was saying that.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. No, let's warm up. Let's just sit cozy around the fire that is this wonderful moment. Because I don't think it's a mistake. I think you were giving an honest account of your thought process on it. But now you realize that you are accidentally off script. Now you fear that the money that you put in to buying the Sci-10 Brukenkate DVD box set and getting the little 3x5 cue card index cards that come with it, you've now gone off script. And you've now. I know. Go ahead. I'm having fun with you. Go ahead. It is fun, by the way.
I understand the point you're getting at. Now, again, that's my fault for not articulating that point. When I was showing you that, yes, we inevitably. When I was saying yes, we do use that. We do use logic and reason, what have you. When I was talking about earlier, what I'm simply showing to you was that when we do arrive at the conclusion, we finally realize that the reason why we're able to reach those conclusions is because we've already assumed that God exists. Again, I'll take the Romans 1:18 perspective. I'll take the perspective of what Romans 1:18 says, that every person knows God exists. Even as a young kid, I always knew. Even though, yes, granted, I was raised in a Christian, or at least my mother was very charismatic, and of course, I would say throughout my entire life, I always knew, like, there was just this unspeakable certainty, or this unspeakable knowledge deep down that God certainly existed already. But this actual salvation, saving knowledge of the truth came about later when I started to actually read the Bible and finally encounter the person of Jesus Christ himself. So when I was talking about, yes, we had that logic and reason, what have you, the fact is demonstrated more in the fact that we're already made in the imago Dei. So when a person comes to faith in Christ, they finally realize, I already knew the truth all along. It's like, I've always known that God existed. I was merely suppressing it for the sake of whatever sinful life I wanted. That's one. And two, it was because of the gospel message that I finally realized that I'm in danger of God's judgment, or I've always known God existed, but I wanted to live in sin. But I was in need of turning from sin and turning to Christ, who died, was buried, and rose again for my sins. That's pretty much what happens when a person comes to salvation in Jesus Christ. We realize that we've already known God existed. We already were borrowing from the proper biblical presuppositions that were established in reality as it is. That's pretty much what happens when a person comes to faith in Christ. Yes, and finally, when it comes down to the subjective or personal salvation, a person, yes, even though there is a sense of deductive reasoning, but the fact of the matter is those deductive reasonings were still presupposing the God of the Bible, which led us there. So again, the presupposition was always there, but the actual revelation, the full conclusion of that presupposition comes about when the person is regenerated, or has that personal born-again encounter with God.
Well, I do take your point. I think that there are some bits that I do agree with, but I think that's going to be sort of a persistent point of disagreement between us, is the idea that you sort of then come to realize correctly that you had always believed in the Christian God. I do think that there's a very strong intuitive drive that makes us crave and makes us inclined towards believing in a supernatural intelligence. I do think that there's a drive for that. That would require some sort of explanation. But I think I want to use what you just said as kind of a point for maybe changing direction a little bit, to sort of illustrate another reason why I think that presup is just a waste of gas, and that is, why don't we do it this way instead? Would you? I don't want to pick, but I want to. I hate to ask you this at a point in a discussion like when we're sort of doing swordplay here. We're kind of we're getting on fine, but I also sort of want to cover some of the topics that we discussed ahead of time. Are you comfortable now telling us a bit about your conversion? Like what I'm asking is, as you've heard other people talk about it. Certainly, I've heard a wealth of stories where somebody says they'll give a story like, well, when I was 17, I was doing this and I got in this kind of trouble and I tried to quit doing this drug or whatever else, right? And then I read this in the Bible, or somebody prayed with me, and they'll describe a very impactful moment. I fell to my knees. I sobbed, and they will describe. So that's what I'm asking about now. Do you mind sharing your testimony with us? Again, I
Okay.
appreciate it. It's poorly timed, but I do welcome it.
Okay, I would say I myself did not necessarily have a road to Damascus encounter, but I would say just over time, I began to really understand more and more as I got more into my late teens, or I would say anywhere between the ages of 19 and 20 and 21, I began to really understand what the Christian message is really about. You know, it's not about this. It's not health and wealth, blab it and grab it. It's not about trying to get a Porsche or $1 million or trying to somehow say in the name of Jesus, be healed of all your diseases. Not to say that I don't believe in miraculous healings, I do. However, the idea of the foundational gospel message was come to Jesus Christ because you're a lost sinner and you realize you sinned against God and you're in danger of his wrath and judgment. Turn from sin and turn to Jesus Christ and have life and salvation. In Jesus Christ, who is indeed God in human flesh, who is God the Son in human flesh, and I believe in the Trinity. But Jesus Christ was God in human flesh who died for your sins, was buried and rose again. Indeed, physically was resurrected from the dead. And now God commands and calls all men to repent of their sins and have faith and have life and salvation in him. And over time, as I really began to understand that message and see what it really is, I began to just sort of trust and believe that much more and really began to understand more of the realities that come along with that. So I would say that's pretty much, I would say that's more or less my conversion, as it were. I did not have that one moment where I suddenly encountered Christ, the gates of heaven opened up, the angels were singing, the music was going, and I was bawling my eyes out, nothing like that. Although that would have been awesome to encounter God that way.
I do, yeah. I do like that. I'm going to say I appreciate that because, for one, I certainly appreciate your honest discussion about it. I think these things are helpful. It's also, it's good for me too, because I do, it's nice to hear sort of a different version, kind of a refreshing, a bit of a different version, and one that requires a lot of contemplation. I'm going to say there's something a little unsatisfying of somebody who describes a very emotional event and then they made a life-changing decision based on it. I mean, obviously, as a believer, you're happy that at least they made the right decision in your view, right? If somebody says, "Oh, I was doing all these things, and then one day I just came to Christ, and I just knew, I repented my sins," and then afterwards, people talk about the Bible. I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." You're at least you made a step in the right direction. From your point of view, that's definitely a step in the right direction. So I appreciate that. But I'll tell you that I think when you think of sort of rational thinking, that's really not a good basis to make a decision on. And I would say that both ways. I had a great discussion with Befuddled over in the Carm server one night about, she made this wonderful statement that just really resonated with me. She said, I do think there are a lot of rational justifications for an atheistic position, but I don't believe that my conversion to atheism was in any way rational. And I laughed when she said it because I totally get that. I could argue all day about, how I thought about this, I thought about that. Or no, sorry, I could argue all day about, how certain religions are irrational. It's actually perfectly rational to believe that the universe exists without a unifying consciousness. But when it comes down to it, do you think I really changed my mind about it for that reason? No, But and this wasn't my story, but just for example, you must have heard people say when you ask them, "Why are you an atheist?" They'll say, "Oh, I was a believer until 16, and then my aunt had cancer," and then and they'll have some story that they just went, "I hate you, God," and then you're like, "Okay, that's not rational." And I agree, that's not rational.
Right.
Now, obviously, if somebody through whatever emotional process comes to an atheistic position, in my view, they're a little bit better off, right? Because at least they adopt another belief that comports with reality, in my view. But that's in dispute here, so I wouldn't want to. And I also don't think that it's really all that helpful in your life. There are lots of helpful things that come to coming to faith. But I guess I was going to go a different way with this, but I'm so intrigued by what you just said. I guess let's talk about these other things that you're learning about. You said that you've always had a sense that God was there, that there's a governing guidance and intelligence in the universe. And then you've invested time, and I really respect this, although I have to admit I see it as misplaced, that you've been learning about other things, like about atonement. You've been learning these biblical principles about sacrifice and atonement and repentance of sin, right? And learning the story itself about Jesus, going through these various periods of feast and the crucifixion itself and
I
the
do
interment
apologize.
in the tomb.
I do apologize. Give me 1 second, please.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm really glad to see a decently sized audience. I have been keeping an eye on the live chat, including several comments. Phenol Barbital, Phenol Phodium Beetle Mediacs would like to Tell me how my worldview is all destroyed. I might set that up with him. That's fine. And I'm going to say, just while we're waiting for, he's back. Okay, yeah. I just want to throw in, just for the audience's benefit, just a moment of praise. I'm really, really having fun with this because it's a really neat challenge to sort of be vigorous and to try to point out to somebody, well, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, and to have that person actually listen. I've really missed this. I mean, obviously you don't agree with it, although I'm really happy about how many times you've said, oh, I see your point, but, and then you tell me why I'm wrong. That's an actual conversation. That's something that's been missing on my channel for a long time. So I really appreciate you being here.
I actually want to send you at least a few things over the chat if you want to take a look at it. One of it is going to be a book called Born Believers. Another one is a video by Jason Lyle, a creation scientist. Yeah, this will be on your own if you want to take a look at it. So at least present it to you, so you at least have a bit more of an understanding as to where I'm coming from with these things.
Okay, what I'm trying to do here, because I can post links in the live chat. So I just typed in book recommendation, Born Believers, and then the next message is a link to the Amazon page, which would probably just 1 second.
Okay, give me one
Just a different, just go to a different one, that'll be fine. And then there was a second one. Oh no, there wasn't a second one.
Oh yes, there is. It's a video.
Okay, yeah.
It's about an hour-long I wouldn't say sermon, but a presentation by Jason Lyle, a Bible-believing Christian who takes the same position I do philosophically when it comes down to the Christian faith. He's a presuppositionalist, and he breaks it down essentially what a lot of the things I sort of believe in he breaks it down pretty well, I would say. He's a scientist. He takes the 6 days, 6 to 10,000. Well, he said 6,000. I would say more 6 to 10,000 because I understand in Genesis there seems to be a bit of a gap, or there seems to be a bit of an unaccounted for a couple generations. So I say the universe is about 6 to 10,000 years old. But apart from that, I thought I'd at least send those 2 links to you.
Okay, sorry, and Lyle is L-I, is Lil,
L-I-S-L-E.
Like, but without the apostrophe. Okay, I got you.
L-I-S-L-E.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm struggling with this. I got to fix this URL too. I just took off the little. Oh, there's an ampersand at the end. Ampersand T. Okay, got it. I'm just trying to clean off. There's a little bit of chaff on the end of that URL, so that one should take you straight to it to the very beginning. Yeah.
And so you have an audience watching this too, or listening to this?
Oh, wait, I don't necessarily want to play it through in the Hangout now. I also want to kind of keep it short. I want to keep my Hangout sort of closer to bite size. I'm not a big fan of these big 4-hour Hangouts. Unless there's something in particular you wanted to play through that one, I can play it through. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I was just going to say, I was just wondering because I think you mentioned a few different times during this discussion that you had some people sort of listening in or watching or something like that. Oh
yeah, we got an audience of I don't know what I've been watching. I'm looking at the live chat, but I don't see how many. 48 watching. That's a fair audience. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know what? If I had G-Man come in and I just told him he was stupid, it'd be over 100. I got to say, I'm having a lot more fun with this. For one thing, it's a bigger challenge. Like you're actually saying some stuff that's sensible and resonates, and I'm mindful and respectful because I kind of get it too of that. Like when you talk about your experiences, I mean, your faith isn't just based on I made the wisecrack about the site. I like that you laughed at my wisecrack too about the Side 10 Brukenkate DVD box set. I'm glad you appreciated that as the joke that it was. And it's my encouragement to say you got to think for yourself. I'm glad that you sort of participate in this outreach. But Side 10 Brukenkate is not nearly as smart or as effective as he likes to think himself to be. Like when you think about all the testimonies you've heard in your life, how many of them have ever said something like, well, the reason I came to Christ was because premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's not Brukenkate, that's somebody else, right? But I can tell you, like, you look at video clips of Brukenkate is obnoxious. Let me just say it that way. he might be, Bruton Cate's the kind of guy who might be considered ill-mannered in most countries of the world. For a Canadian, he's downright obnoxious. And I would love to find a single example of a person who was an atheist and had a conversation with Seitan Brukenkate and said, boy, he really opened my mind to this. I listened to that guy talk and I went, yeah, he's on to something. I'm totally going to do this. And then they came to Christ. I would be shocked if there was even one.
Okay, I would say this in regards to good brother Sai. I would say that he is a bit aggressive, and I would say that I do wish sometimes he would slow down a little bit. I'll admit it. I'll admit it out loud to the atheists that are like, yeah, and I'll admit it out loud. I do feel that brother Sai can be a bit harsh, but I definitely do not disagree with a lot of. I definitely have to agree with a lot of what he says in general. So I disagree with his delivery. However, the content I do agree with 100% more oftentimes than not.
Well, I would encourage you to be mindful of the thing I was warning about before. I mean, first off, I so much respect that you're saying you sort of, you're not just a big fan and you're just like, oh, well, everything he does is perfect, because it is important that in people that we respect, that we also, we draw the best from them and leave behind the things that they probably should change about themselves. So I really respect that. You sort of, I mean, you won't go as far as to say obnoxious, but he just strikes me so obnoxious. I'm sure he's a very, very generous fellow to those that he loves. And I think that, he does come across as harsh. Maybe we can leave it at that. But I would say you really want to be attentive as you go through his material too. Is he just playing that game that HogTie was talking about, where identify a flaw or a shortcoming in someone else's worldview and then declare that worldview to be failed, and then therefore declare victory that my worldview is perfect? Because when it comes down to it, not perfect, but my worldview is the correct one. Because when it comes down to it, every flaw that Seitan Brukenkate identifies in an atheist worldview also exist for Seitan Brukenkate's worldview and for every other Christian's worldview. That's just a thing. That's just how epistemology works.
I would argue again. I have to argue that the flaws that you say are existing in the Christian worldview, by virtue of the revelation we have in Scripture, are simply not there. And one simply studies the very context of what the Bible says, you'll find that those flaws really are not there.
Okay, well, let's do that. Let's do that. But I want to sort of tack on one more little point, and then let's talk about the flaws there. But I do want to say that this is another thing I think about a lot of these apologetics. I'll say this of Brukenkate and the Slickian style. And by the way, I really like Matt Slick. I mean, I know. I'm going to get messages about that later because he's such a jerk. Matt Slick's, honestly, I got to tell people. I'm going to interrupting myself to interrupt myself with this observation, just to get it out of the way. I mean, I've been friends with Matt Slick for years, and it's sort of a come and go, on and again, off again relationship. He's a good guy. We're not really intermingled with each other's lives. We sort of know what's going on, and we sort of in and out of each other's life. But he's a very, very generous fellow, and he's very considerate and compassionate. His plate's kind of full right now with doing his home life, but then he's still out there helping other people. And I have a lot of respect for the guy. I do think his apologetic is very misplaced, so I'm going to say some unkind things about that, but it's nothing I haven't said to him already, and it doesn't hurt his feelings. I think a lot of these apologetics that are embarked on, the Seitan Brukenkate style or the Slickian style, they're very, very misguided in one fashion. And that is, they present themselves, and I think you guys even fool yourself into thinking this. Let me ask you just real quick. It doesn't have to be a long answer, but who are you talking to when you do these apologetics? Who is your target audience? Who do you want to listen to these things?
Well, pretty much anyone who's listening. That's pretty much how the gospel message works. It's generally offered to anyone under the sound of our voices.
It's the gospel message, yeah, sure, the gospel message. But when you talk to somebody about what's your foundation, when you ask a question, you asked me a question one day, or you asked Chris a question, sorry. Can you give a justification for your foundation of your morality or your epistemology, whichever it was? When you ask that question, are you, who are you trying to convince that you've got a good point?
Well, I would say it really depends on the person I'm talking to. If it's an atheist, I would ask them, how do they define logic, reason, truth, and objectivity, laws of logic and everything in a constantly evolving sort of good to you world.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, you're much better than the others at keeping other people's spirits in mind. When you talk to me or you're talking to Chris, I honestly feel that I'm on your mind, that Chris is on your mind, that other atheists are on your mind. I actually think you're one of the few people who actually puts your oar in the water towards trying to help them. I just think you're using a bad apologetic. So I want to be fair to you in that way and set it a bit in contrast. But this is the thing that I would encourage you as a believer, as a good person who wants to do well for other people, to recognize the deception that's going on, and it's self-deception. And I'm going to pick on a couple individuals like, Brojo, who I get along with really well, but I think he's terrible in apologetics. He's just abysmal. And Matt Yester, who I don't get along with, and I think he's terrible at apologetics. Guys like that, they're not talking to the atheists. What they're doing here, let me characterize it this way. I want to ask you if you agree with this as a characterization. What I see happening now in modern Christian apologetics, especially these evangelical presuppositionalists, what I see happening is they're basically saying to themselves, well, we've always had the high ground. People believed in God, people believed in Jesus, and we've always lived pretty comfortably without having to walk around and justify these things that are perfectly obvious. Obviously, Jesus Christ is our Savior. Like, why would anybody doubt that? But now we live in a world where those things have come into doubt. Now we live in a world where we need to provide justification, or we're being asked to provide justifications for our beliefs. Why do you believe the earth is 6,000 years old? Why do you believe the earth is flat? If you believe it's flat, I know you don't, and then why do you believe in God, the whole God Jesus thing anyway? Now we're being challenged with these things, and we've taken a good run at proving it, but we cannot. So we're now looking silly. And I think who they're preaching to other believers. They are, to borrow a phrase, preaching to the choir. When a Matt Yester goes after an atheist and says, well, what's your epistemic framework? Well, how do you justify that? Well, I've got everything on one side of the page, you've got everything on the other side of the page. And you're trying to, we haven't got the foundation, and we've got the whole house built. And he says all those phrases, that is entirely signaling fellow believers, dear fellow believers, my brothers and sisters, you're not stupid. Don't feel stupid. You're not stupid for believing in God and Jesus. I know people say we're stupid for believing in God and Jesus, but you're not stupid. I'm not stupid. It's this atheist that's stupid. That's the part I want you to react to, because that's what I hear. Every time I hear a Matt Yester or a Brojo or a DD or even Matt Slick, and to a lesser extent you, when I hear you guys go out and say, look, I'm going to show how this atheist has a goofy worldview, it's you're really signaling each other, don't feel dumb. Don't feel dumb for believing in God and Jesus. It's this atheist that's dumb. You think that's fair?
Well, I would say this. Maybe I haven't been paying that much close attention to what we say and how we say it. I would say I've noticed it. I would say that very description you just gave, I've noticed it with Darth Dawkins, unfortunately. I would say I've noticed that sort of mentality with him predominantly. With other believers, I'm sorry. Sorry, let me correct myself. I do apologize. That might have been a lie. Yeah, I do apologize. That was a lie. Maybe I say I definitely heard it at least maybe a few times with other people like Brojo or Matt Yester. Again, I do apologize for that. It just came to mind. I was like, yeah, I think I may have heard it. But in regards to that, the very thing you just described, I would say I've heard it mostly with Darth Dawkins, but not as maybe.
You're causing me such pain here because I'm enjoying this so much. There's something fun about these hangouts when the other guy's just a jerk. I think what you just described is exactly my position. That I shouldn't ever say that somebody's just completely obnoxious, and then there's another believer over here who 100% is focused on saving souls, because it's a spectrum. And the way you just said it, I completely agree with. DD is way out there with just being obnoxious and just trying to make somebody else show his fellow believers that other person is stupid. And Matt Yester is not nearly as bad as that. I mean, I say some unkind things about Matt Yester, but I've talked to him, privately and separately, and I think he's not nearly as bad as that. But I think he's worse than Brojo. And then I think you got Matt Slick trailing behind in that, because he's also compassionate, cares about people's souls, but he gets a little obnoxious at times. And then there's you way at the other side of it, where you say these things that strike me as in the obnoxious camp, but there's no way when it comes from you as obnoxious. Like when you say, well, you have to borrow from the Christian worldview. I just find that such a, I would love you to explain that phrase, by the way, what the heck you think that even means. But you're like, well, I guess what I'm saying is I think that the Christians, when they're out there embarking on this sort of apologetic, they need to think about what really is my motivation. Am I more like a Baptist702, or am I more like a Darth Dawkins, right? And I think you do well to be over on the Baptist702 side of the scale. recognizing that you do have to shake up the atheists a little bit, but just going out there and telling them that, oh, your worldview has failed, is not the way to save souls. So I hope that's a fair assessment of it. But
I would say I would definitely, like I said, I know it's primarily with Darth Dawkins, and then I would say a little bit with Matt Yester and Brojo. And I would say I would definitely say that, again, if they are being, what's I'm looking for, if they are being harsh, or unloving or unchristlike, I'll be sure to at least bring it up with them. However, it's very important to point out that if indeed they're trying to comfort the Christian, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The Bible does encourage us, the Bible does command us to encourage each other and comfort one another. So if that's indeed what they're doing, I can't, I would say they should keep doing it, but I would also make sure that they're doing it to the degree where they are able to show our fellow brothers and sisters, why they're not dumb, why we do have that foundation of true logic and wisdom and knowledge in the person of Jesus Christ. And the atheist, as the Bible teaches, is the fool.
That's I was with you up to the last thing. But that's an interesting question too, about the sort of the challenges of the modern Christian. Like I've heard this great phrase. Was it from Matt Slick or from, it might have been from Bible Thumping Wingnut. I wish I could remember. I want to give credit to it because he wasn't the original author for it, but it's a wonderful phrase. He says, Christianity is the anvil that has worn out a lot of hammers. Right. So the weird thing about Christianity, like when you sort of look over your shoulder now and think about, the eye blink that is your lifespan in the context of human history, in the context of church history, it's really amazing that Christianity, with very little change. I mean, people are going to object to this. I'm saying very little change. There obviously have been some changes to the church over the years in its expression and theology in various ways. But I'm saying that the core message has always been there for many, many years. And there have been a varied attacks and criticisms and questions about it. And I love that expression. It's the anvil that has worn out a lot of hammers. So you've got that long-standing thing that you can rely on. But now you guys are facing a challenge that is relatively unique in Christian history. Now you're facing a world where you've got science and technology. Like we're beyond the whole age of reason. We're beyond the whole Enlightenment, right? We're centuries past that, and now we're in an age of scientific enterprise. This whole idea about the scientific method is something that was, we've always had the notion that making predictions and observation is a helpful way to learn about the world, but the actual canonization, if I can use that term, of the scientific method, of these ideas about acknowledging your cognitive biases and setting them aside and setting up experiments and comparing this versus that, and hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing was invented in the middle of the 20th century. You ever heard somebody talk about the null hypothesis? You want to describe the history of science. If they start talking about the null hypothesis, that shows they know nothing, because hypothesis testing as a statistical method was invented in the middle of the 20th century. So these are all very, very new ideas, and then throw on top of it the internet. So I think that modern Christians are faced with a challenge that is very, very different from what it used to be like. And I take your point. I mean, maybe that needs to be an important focus of fellowship, is what does it mean to be a Christian in a world where there are many people in the world who believe they're being rational when they point out that you appear silly. Right? In the past, you used to just say, well, that's the fool who says that. That's the reprobate mind who says that. But now you have the challenge of dealing with that sort of criticism amongst people who are not fools and not reprobate, except obviously they're sinning because they turn their back on God. But
well, that's pretty much the standard we have. Those who indeed are not Bible-believing Christians those who are not truly born again are reprobate. They are lost sinners in need of the great shepherd, Jesus Christ himself. So we do point out that those who are unbelievers are the reprobate. They are the fools who borrow from the God of the Bible but reject Jesus Christ and choose their sinful lifestyles. And I'll have to agree with Brother Sai when he says this, where he says the ultimate choice really is Jesus Christ or absurdity and damnation. And most people would choose absurdity because they love their sin. They love the idea that they get to say no to God and get to sleep around with their boyfriend or girlfriend or a same-sex partner or drugs, alcohol, so on and so forth.
That's it. That's something I would disagree with just very aggressively and vehemently, because that's another, and again, I just use that phrase, it's just plain silly. I'll tell you some of the things that are wrong with it. So Saitan Brukenkate asserts repeatedly, without ever once providing justification for it, he makes this statement: the Christian God is necessary for X, where X can be anything. If there weren't the Christian God, there wouldn't be morality. If there weren't the Christian God, there wouldn't be the universe itself. If there weren't the Christian God, there wouldn't be justice. If there weren't the Christian God, there wouldn't be rationality. Without the Christian God, you can't have rationality at all. So obviously the Christian God exists because the Christian God is necessary. And then somebody says, well, what about some other God? Well, then he pulls some shifty nonsense like saying, oh, well, notice how you have to renounce your atheism in order to blah, blah, blah. No, that's not renouncing your atheism. That's asking a question. Well, what if it were some other God? Like, why couldn't it be Zeus? Why couldn't it be the Reason Rock? Right? Why couldn't it be whatever? Like the tide-making rock and the Reason Rock. Right? Why couldn't it be something else? So he quite often makes the claim the Christian God is necessary. And I have on several occasions, a couple times with Saitan Brukenkate, a couple of times with Arcane Logos, I have asked, and I'll put this question to you: can you prove that statement? Can you prove that not just a God, not just a force, not just a being, can you prove your claim that the Christian God is the thing that is necessary for all these other things to exist? That there's literally no other alternative for them?
Yes, indeed, actually.
Oh, let's rock it.
Okay, well, now it's actually a bit of a long and drawn out explanation. So what I'm gonna do, if you don't mind, is send you a video that can explain it a lot better than I can, if that's okay with you, because it really is salvation. Because it really is a long process to explain this. So I feel like this guy here in this video explains it a lot better than I can. And to the audience out there who is listening, I would love for you guys to take a look at it also, because I think this really does hit. Now, I wouldn't say in the absolute sense hit every single nail there is to hit. However, it does sort of cover all. It does cover in a more general sense, in a very broad way, the reason why we're able to objectively conclude that it must be the God. It is indeed the God of the Bible, as opposed to any of the other gods or goddesses or universal spirit beings in existence in different religions and cults or what have you. So let me see if I can find this.
Okay, well, the link you had just sent. Oh, I'm sorry, you didn't send.
No, I didn't send it yet.
I copied. Okay, I see what I did. I copied the same link you sent before. Okay, I got you.
Okay, give me just 1 second.
Well, as you're doing that, I'll just mention that I'm certainly curious to see it, because this is a question I've been asking literally for years, is to make a demonstration and to be clear on what the claim is. So you can pick anything. I'd say, prove that the Christian God is necessary for X, where X can be morality or justice or rationality or cheese toast. It doesn't matter. Prove that, because you guys say Christian God is necessary for anything, let alone everything. So there's really two claims in there. One is that the Christian God is necessary, and the second one is the Christian God is sufficient. And I've asked people, just pick one. Prove the sufficiency claim. Prove the necessity claim. And I've never gotten an answer. The only thing I got it as an answer in terms of words was both Sai and Arcane Logos had used the phrase, well, due to the impossibility of the contrary. And that is in no sense a proof or an argument for anything. It's literally a restatement of the necessity claim. And I'm sort of filling some time here while you're hunting for the next video link. I would be kind of surprised to see. I mean, by the way, I do know that there are things like, I know Rabbi Zacharias has some claims where he, as does William Lane Craig. They make some arguments where they say that, well, some of these attributes, so there has to be a creator, and second, some of these attributes are necessary for creation to work the way it does. Now, they don't ever prove that either, but then they do say, well, the Christian God has those attributes. So, for example, I'll give you one example, and this is something I would find unsatisfying, is if somebody says, oh, well, the creator has to be a personal God. And, hey, the Christian God's a personal God, therefore the Christian God is the creator. Well, why does the creator have to be a personal God? I've never heard a scrap of support for that. But I say, as I'm filling time, I know you're still looking for a link there. So, again, an enjoyable conversation. I just, I'll sort of say for the audience too that, and if you can still hear me, Baptist, but some of the criticisms I have of this is a lot of these stock phrases like, you have to borrow from the Christian worldview, or only the Christian God can explain this or that, or only the Christian God can account for this or that. And these are just like they really resonate like statements that come on a little set of 3x5 index cards that you get with your DVD box set. There's one other thought I had there, that reprobate thing. That was another thing I said I was going to really vehemently disagree when he made that point, if you're still with us, Baptist, that this idea that the reason people don't come to God is because, as you said, want to sleep with their boyfriends or their girlfriends, that people are avoiding judgment. There's a whole conversation in there. Oh, good, you're back. Let's do that first then.
Okay, I said.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Yes, I sent it to you. It's right underneath false religions versus the Christian God. Now, I really wish I had the whole video, but this is at least the portion of the question you were asking. At least addresses the question you were asking about why not, Buddha or Zeus or Thor and all that other good stuff. So the video is at least almost about 30 minutes long. So if you want, you can take a look at that, and then, of course, if you still want to discuss that, we can get back to that later.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. I never, if you think that it would do a good job of answering, I'll certainly watch that. And then, and by the way, I do hope we talk again, because when you and I were talking before that we went live, like one of the things I say is I like that when I do a hangout on my channel, it's usually not just about God and Christian or evolution and creation. There's a lot of other issues, and I kind of hope that we can do this again sometime to just talk about some other topics. Like I don't know if we ever run dry. If you and I ever run dry on topics, one of us can just say to the other, "What do you think about Donald Trump?" And then I'm sure that just seems to be nowadays. That's the thing that you can say if you're ever out of something to say. Yeah, I do want to say about the Christian faith thing, though, that really always kind of surprises me is that when somebody says, like, when they insert in my head or anyone else's head a model, an explanation for why I simply don't come to the same conclusion. This idea that I love my sin and I hate God, that's something I just find an absolutely, when I say incredible, I mean lacking credibility. Just a genuinely bizarre thing to say in conversation with somebody, especially when you're dealing with somebody like me. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm saying, and I've thought through this process, what would happen? I know it's kind of hard to put yourself in those shoes, but I've listened to so many testimonies, and I've seen people who are like new believers and people who have been believers for literally decades, and how it changes them and that sort of thing. And I think, I don't know what changes I've got to make. Obviously, to be a Christian, the biggest change I have to make is to wholeheartedly believe the story. Wholeheartedly believe that Jesus died for my sins and has a plan for me, and that repentance, turning to Jesus Christ, is the way, and that eternal torment awaits if I don't do so. That's a whole set of beliefs that I have to change. But then beyond that, what else do I have to change? And I would say really nothing, because pardon me as I cough chuckle, because it's not that I'm perfect, but in terms of the way that Christians are going to be assessed in the afterlife, well, I would just go to heaven. I mean, I have some bad habits. I don't know.
I would disagree. I would say that when a person indeed comes to saving faith in Jesus Christ, their worldview does change, and that really does affect essentially everything about them. And that's what happens when a person's worldview is changed and is grounded in the very person of Jesus Christ. It does literally change everything about their life.
Well, it would certainly change my concept of reality, right? So a lot of the things I understand about, like, I know one thing that puzzles you about my view is this idea that I believe in a universe, not a mindless universe. There are minds in the universe, but that I believe that the universe functions on its own, with no one at the helm. Right? They're asteroids and comets and just spinning stuff in space, and stuff goes on, and it doesn't need anyone's help to do that stuff. And it's absolutely amazing what's happened on our planet. How these organic molecules came together, and then life formed, and then even weirder than that, humanity arises from this, and we have discussions about philosophy. That to me is absolutely amazing. But the fact that I know it's puzzling for you to sort of accept that that's my actual belief, that can happen without a guiding super intelligence. That's just a point of disagreement that we have. But when it comes down to the changes, I mean, yeah, I'd have to change a lot of beliefs in my understanding of the universe. But would I change as a person? Would I become more rude or less rude? Would I murder more people or fewer people?
When a person's worldview to that degree really does change, it affects the very person. And that's what we're talking about. That's the spiritual encounter. It's more than just merely a person's beliefs in the mental ascension sense. There is a spiritual reality that changes the core of the very core of their person.
But you guys say that, but then I don't know, like what could possibly, I mean, yeah, I would, that relationship would be there. I understand that things like that would change. I'm not saying there'd be no changes at all, but in terms of when people say, I guess sorry, let's focus. I know what the problem is, where we lost our focus here, is the idea that the reason I don't do that is because I love my sin. And to me, the reason that doesn't make sense is because I literally would have to, there's nothing I would have to stop doing. The only thing I would have to start doing is believing. And yes, I would have these changes. I would have this amazing, amazing relationship in my life. Yes, all those profound changes would happen. But in terms of the stated reason for why I resist that is because I love my sin, right? I mean, I'm going to look over my shoulder first. I'm going to say, as I said before, I would still be able to murder the same number of people that I do now. I would be able to have intimate relations with all the same number of people that I do now. I'd be able to lie as much as I do now. I'd be able to bear false witness as much as I do now. Right? Just literally nothing would have to change in my life.
I would say no. When a person when a person does have that spiritual encounter with God, there literally is a change in how they conduct themselves by virtue or by the very power of the encounter, or the reality of encountering God himself.
Do they change to perfection?
Not to absolute perfection, but there is a genuine growth and change of personhood over time, to where they become more holy, they begin to be more truthful, they begin to become more intelligent or more honest, or they have a foundation for intelligence, which does essentially help their intelligence.
No, it doesn't give you a foundation. We covered that. It doesn't give you a foundation for intelligence. It gives you on your existing foundation for intelligence. It just gives you an extra thing on that itself remains unjustified. But all those other changes you said, okay, yeah, it's true. So when you compare a 16-year-old Christian to a 50-year-old Christian, that 50-year-old is going to be smarter, more mature, more calm, more honest. But guess what? I'm 50, and I'm more mature, more honest, more compassionate, more generous, more patient. All those growths that you talk about happen over decades of a Christian's life happens with anybody else that is contemplative about their life. This, to me, is the thing that many evangelical apologists are absolutely missing about the lives of atheists. The thing that makes you a better person, let me make this point. The thing that makes you a better person down the road is being contemplative, being surrounded by people who establish rules and contingencies for you. My wife lets me get away with some stuff. There's some stuff she doesn't let me get away with. My mom did not let me get away with some stuff, right? And you need to be contemplative about it. There was a point in my life when I thought about, how you're a kid, you're a bit of a fib teller. And then when you're a teenager, you have these crazy stories about yourself that you just imagine to be true. And then you retell them, after you're out of high school. At some point you realize, why am I telling these stories? That's not true. Everybody goes through that maturation process. And now at my moderately advanced age, I find that I can't be bothered to lie. I find a real not that I ever, again, I want to clarify, not that I ever really had a serious lying problem. I'm saying I lied the way that other people typically lie at that age. But now, I'm like, my dad's 73. We had a conversation about this last week, about this whole, why would you lie anyway? What a hassle. And it's a deep change in your character that when you're 40, 50, 70, your character just improves if you're a thoughtful, contemplative person. If you find that you can be a thoughtful, contemplative person based on your personal relationship with Jesus Christ and based on your study of the Bible, then good for you. I'm glad that you've become and you're increasingly a thoughtful and considerate and honest person. But please don't fail to acknowledge that I've done all the same things without that personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the thing that you guys fail to acknowledge.
There are some who do go through that genuine change, but over time, there are unbelievers and believers who go through that general change. However, if you're talking about good deeds and works, how should I put this in words? The idea of measuring how far ahead is one person in regards to their moral or ethical behavior is not necessarily helpful in trying to measure which one is greater than the other. Because by and large, if you really want to go down that road, by and large, Christians have been very more generous and beneficial to society as a whole because of their worldview. I mean, history is literally marked with a lot. If you look at history in the advent of Christianity, societies have been literally revolutionized because they've been heavily influenced by the Christian worldview.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. I think those advances are done in spite of the Christian worldview. One of the problems, especially, we're not just talking about general Christianity too. We're talking specifically about now this modern American evangelicalism. One of my concerns about that particular theology is that it contains no accountability, zero accountability and consequences for moral misdeeds. You can be a heinous person. You can conduct heinous acts. You can be a malicious person, and you have no accountability. And that alarms me considerably. Right?
I'm afraid I must staunchly disagree with you. That's one.
You will.
Staunchly disagree with you because okay, a lot of the laws that were made in America and other parts of the world, well, at least with the advent of Christianity, was because people were heavily influenced by Christian principles, such as the "Thou shalt not steal," "Thou shalt not murder," and "bear false witness." All these really came from the idea of God's law in the Old Testament. That's literally what gave the rise to a lot of the American justice system. Granted, the founding fathers were not perfect. Yes, slavery was in existence. However, the overarching reality of their philosophy was heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian principles. Yeah. Otherwise, if it was atheistic, if they were atheists or if they were non-theistic, there was no way. I say this with absolute certainty. I'm very positive that if these men were atheists or agnostics, they would not have given birth to the nation that we have today, because they would have had no means to say that a person should be free to do what he wants, but a person should submit to pretty much a leader or a dictator and what he says in order to lead us, because humanity is just bipedal protoplasm that can't do anything on its own.
Yeah, that does not characterize anyone's position even close. It's funny, I don't even know where to start with that, because there were so many things you said in there that I disagree with it. And I was going to say, what I was going to start was by saying, do you actually believe this? But you very helpfully pointed out, no, you generally do believe this. Do you believe that it is? I'm asking this rhetorically, because you're saying, okay, do you actually believe that it is sourced, that the source of all this is Judeo-Christian philosophy, that the source of an idea like do not murder, do not steal, that the primary source is Judeo-Christian theology?
I know this with absolute certainty.
Okay, it's not. It's not. Okay, and then let me just press on it, because you said several things in there, and all of them were things I said were unfounded claims. It was a little bit shotgunny. They're all related. I'm not accusing you of shotgunning, though, because they're fire hosing, because they were all related. So I'm not saying you're all over the map. I think you had a very coherent point, but just based upon a bunch of assertions that are just demonstrably not true. So, for example, the idea that Western culture, or even specifically American culture, is based on ideas rooted in Christianity. It's not. Further, you're again, I'm going to list them, and then we can discuss whichever ones entertain you. The idea that it couldn't have happened in an atheistic fashion, or it couldn't have happened in some other regime or some other outlook on life or worldview. It just couldn't have happened. It just couldn't have happened because they wouldn't have been able to provide a support or justification for these things. That's demonstrably not true, because first off, it's not grounded in Christian thinking. The story of Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection doesn't really give people guidance for how to construct a country. But all the things that are good about a society are things that are demonstrable through secular means. Now, if you don't mind, I want to use the word secular in a particular way. I don't want to confuse it with atheism. Right? So atheism is simply a position on that issue about whether or not God exists. To say secular means we're going to discuss things without express mention of origins. So if you and I decide to go for lunch somewhere, and then you say, I've had the chicken here before, it's really good, but whatever, then like you implicitly in your head, you're saying, I enjoyed the chicken, and it's because of God's existence, and God made this wonderful world for me where I can enjoy this restaurant that prepares this chicken, right? And I say, well, last time I was here, I had fish and I really enjoyed that. I don't expressly say it, but implicit as well, because the universe came together, bipedal goo to you, all those phrases you use, whatever my belief is, it doesn't matter. We're still having a secular conversation. implicit is the groundings for these things, but the actual meat of what we're discussing, meat of what we're discussing, is based on the secular concerns of what is on the table in front of us. The reason why I want to use the word secular that way is when we talk about society, when you have a principle that says we're going to have a law that says people shouldn't go around murdering each other. Oh, well, people are still doing it. Okay, well, I guess we have to establish a police force. Oh, we don't know what to do with these people. I guess we're going to have to build jails. Or maybe we'll set up an electric chair and we'll kill some of them. I don't know. Those are all secular things. You can say that they're in some way connected to your theology, or I can say that they're some way connected to my understanding of the universe. But basically, when we're at the same table, we're discussing what's on the table. That's what I mean by secular. Okay.
Okay.
It doesn't mean religious or atheist. It just means having that discussion apart from people's metaphysical understanding of the universe.
Okay.
So anyway, what I'm saying then is all these ideas: don't rape, don't steal. Don't whatever. These things are all easily attainable through secular means, right? Your society, I mean, without going into an elaborate description of it, because I think it's obvious to you that a society that says, look, whether you believe in God or not, how about we just don't murder each other? That they proceed with that secular discussion, they're going to quickly discover that your society's better off, that murdering and stealing are bad things. You don't need the Christian faith. And the fact that those things were penned long before any book of the Bible, I just can't believe you're serious in your claim that you think that its origin is actually Judeo-Christian faith.
Okay, then how do you explain people like George Washington saying religion is as necessary to reason as reason is to religion? The one cannot exist without the other. My first wish is to see this plague of mankind, war, banished from earth. It would be found in unjust. Oh, excuse me. That's the wrong quote. I mean, yes, he does point out religion. However, that's not the exact quote I was looking for.
Well, that's okay. Even if it was the other one, I can explain it just fine. I can explain it because how do I explain that quote? Because that's what George Washington believed. But so what? I mean, when it comes to, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that. I would not want to make the claim that there are just simply no influences from Christianity on American history. Obviously, American history was forged in the crucible of a well-established Christian faith. And there's also the idea that, post-Enlightenment, there were discussions of deism, and some of them may have been deist. And there were even some atheists in the mix there or whatever. But the idea is when they started talking about what's right and wrong, I do believe those people embarked on setting out a country with the understanding of fundamental freedoms, fundamental rights that are endowed upon us by a creator. Without even specifying who the creator was, surely many of them, if not most of them, believe that was the Christian God. But my point is, so what? I'm not saying that it had no influence at all. Clearly, it had an influence on it.
Okay.
But I'm saying that that's not actually the source of it.
Again, HogTie, how can you be so dismissive by saying so what when you yourself just demonstrated, and it was primarily because of the influence of the Christian worldview that these men arrived at the laws and regulations that they did. Because it's the very foundation of the Bill of Rights, the foundation of the freedom of speech, freedom of religious practice, freedom of the press, things of this nature that were brought about through Judeo-Christian perspectives or Judeo-Christian ideas.
I can answer that. Yeah, I can answer that because what I'm saying is a couple of things. One is that it is yes, they're influenced by their Christian upbringing. As a lot of, by the way, I think a lot of my decisions in life are influenced by my Christian upbringing. Mm-hmm. That's that happens. But I'm not saying that they're completely independent of that influence. But the idea that that's somehow the source is to accidentally or maybe you do it on purpose, but to incorrectly attribute Christianity as the source of things like justice and fairness and liberty and freedom, because those ideas had been around long before Christianity. And then when you mentioned specifically the Bill of Rights, I mean, certainly the context for the Bill of Rights, while absent mention, here's what's funny. A lot of people talk about God in the Constitution. And what's really funny is, and you probably knew this already, but no part of your Constitution, including the Bill of Rights up front, ever mentions any God or any creator. Nowhere in there. And yet Canada, a secular nation, does in fact mention God. It's in the preamble to the Constitution Act. So like where the beginning of your Constitution is the Bill of Rights, the first few sections of our Constitution Act are the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're very much on parallel. But ours has a preamble that expressly mentions our creator God. But regardless, I mean, either of those things, I mean, both. So for example, your country has an express protection against government-compelled self-incrimination. as worded at the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Where in the Bible does it assure that people should be protected against self-incrimination?
Because
it's just not a thing.
Again, actually, in the Old Testament, and the Bible does now, the exact word self-incrimination is not necessarily written there. However, the Bible does demonstrate that if indeed I committed a crime, I don't have to tell you that. It's your responsibility as the one accusing me of the crime to prove that I did fill in the blank. So I have the right to literally say I'm not going to openly testify that I actually did something, or I have the right to plead that I won't incriminate myself. If indeed whether or not I did the crime, that's up to the person who's accusing me to actually prove that I committed the crime. So the Bible says, let everything be confirmed on 2 or 3 witnesses, or 2 or 3 independent lines of testimony, where the person, for example, when it comes down to rape, there's semen testing, there's DNA testing, there's things of that nature, there's time of place, there's even circumstantial evidence, things of that nature, in order to try and lead up to, or what's called independent lines of testimony, in order to prove that little Johnny indeed raped little Susie, or and things of that nature, or indeed there were people who happened to be present or walking by and they witnessed Johnny committing such a heinous crime on Susie, and of course stopped it or called the police, whatever the case may have been.
That's a different. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just something I want to correct in the live chat. But no, that's a different thing. I mean, that doesn't speak to protection against compelled self-incrimination, right? I mean, you're right about the idea about trial, but even that isn't attributable to Christianity. I mean, the idea of putting an accusation to trial is it's far more ancient than even the Chinese had that even without biblical influence. The Code of Hammurabi, sets out the right and the wrong and specifies means by which unverified accusations can be tried. The ancient Greeks had it. Now, mind you, they did have some influence from the Hebrew, but and sorry, just if you do have a specific support for that, because you were saying that it might come from the Bible. If you have somebody did ask for chapter and verse, I'll give you a second to look for it. But in the meantime, I apologize. I'm just going to set aside for a second, just to clarify about what I was saying about the constitutions. I'm talking about 2 different countries. This is Pluto the dog says that the Bill of Rights was an add-on to the Constitution, not a preamble. No, what I'm saying is that I was talking about 2 different countries. So the United States, there's the Constitution, and then there's a set of amendments. And the first 9 amendments? Sorry, I would have misspoken if I would have said it's the beginning of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. What I mean to say is you've got your Constitution that sets out the structure of government. It's then followed by, but still is constitutional law, still on the same level as the Constitution. It's amendments to the Constitution. The first, I think, 9 amendments are the Bill of Rights. Apart from that, I'm talking about the Constitution Act of Canada, which is a different country than yours. There's a preamble to the Constitution Act. Remember, our Constitution is very, very new. It actually occurred within my lifetime. Canada as a nation is not as old as I am. I think it was 1981. And the preamble to the Constitution Act mentions God. Then there's Section 1 of the Constitution Act, which is seen as the beginning of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Right. So the American Constitution has the Constitution and then a set of amendments. The first of those amendments is the Bill of Rights. The Canadian Constitution Act starts with a preamble, and then the beginning of the Constitution Act is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's what I'd meant to say. Okay. Well, derailed us sadly, but I want to make sure when I give out information that I didn't botch it. It's
okay.
Source of stress.
In regards to the history of Canada, I'm not well versed, so I can't necessarily speak to everything that was going on during the time of the establishment of Canada. I'll admit that. But the only country I'm familiar with is, of course, the 13 colonies leading up to the United States. That's the only history I'm familiar with when it comes down to the influences around that time. And I understand the Hammurabi Code and the Chinese may have had something like a trial, whatever the case may have been. However, the very laws which helped, influence that trial or helped to sort of establish, how the trial is going to be ran, or in regards to legal or moral or ethical, whatever the case may have been, were primarily influenced by the Christian worldview. I mean, I think it was John Locke, or one of the great Supreme Court judges during the time of early colonial America, made it very clear that it was through God's law implemented in the land that promoted a free and just society. I forget which judge it was exactly. I wish I could recall it. I'll admit that one I forgot. I honestly forgot that one, but Pastor Jeff Durbin of Apology at Church points that out quite a bit. But
yeah, and I want to thank you for having a good memory too, so that when we went on that little digression into international constitutional law, that you did actually remember what our point was. And I know, Stu, you put on the side here. There's a YouTube video of. Oh no, that was false. That was the other one. 2 or 3 witnesses. You make reference to Deuteronomy chapter 19.
Yes.
At verse 15.
Yes.
So we're before. Okay, so yeah, that's Mosaic law with regard to the trials of accusations, right? But we're before the rape bits and that sort of thing. Let me just pull it up here real quick. Although it's weird when I went to go to my Bible thing, it's making me click this extra thing first. I click that. Okay, I don't know why that had those extra steps. Maybe these Bible people are trying to hack my computer. I forgot. So 19, that's before that stuff. And then which verse was it? Sorry, 15?
Yes.
15, okay. Okay, so I went back up to, then I shall not pity him. I'll put away but thou shalt put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, that it may go well with thee. So again, into verse 14, thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance. This is to do real property report, real property, land and sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Which shalt thou inherit in that land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. So respect boundaries, that sort of thing. So 15, now it is a separate topic. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or any sin or any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. So that's the thing. You can't convict somebody based on the testimony of a single person.
Mm-hmm.
Further, this is delightful. This is going to verse 16. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make a diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness be a false witness and hath testified falsely against his brother, then ye shall do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. So shalt thou put away the evil from among you. Which is funny. That was actually a principle I was explaining to my son yesterday, and my daughter. One of them had accused the other one of lying, and I jumped on. They were bickering about something small, and one of them trotted out that the other one was lying, and I said, okay, now we're dealing with that. And it turned out that was not a lie. It was a false accusation of a lie. So I'd asked, so what do you think should have been done if this person was lying? And they specified a punishment, and I said, okay, then that's what you get, right? And I recognize this is a biblical principle, right? But Hammurabi had the same thing. But you know what I mean? That idea that if you bear false witness against somebody, then whatever you thought ought to be done to them based on your false witness, that's what should be done to you. And I think it's a good starting point when you talk about justice. But again, that's not the origin for that idea. And it's also something that could have been discovered through secular means, right? I mean, I guess what I'm saying, these things, these really important principles that appear in the Bible in one form or another, they're things you can't demonstrate that because they're in the Bible, that we'd have just fumbled about and never figured this out on our own had it not been put into the Bible, right? I mean, obviously other cultures were able to encounter this. We could have encountered these types of things anyway. And in any case, it doesn't demonstrate that God put those things in the Bible. Like, to me, it seems, I understand we're going to take a different position on this, but does it make sense to you when I say this? Well, obviously, the ancient Israelites saw the evils, the horrible consequences of letting people go around and lie about other people, falsely accuse them of committing crimes. And the ancient Israelites in that era, they wrote down stuff like this: do not bear false witness against your neighbor. And if somebody does bear false witness, or if somebody does bear witness against somebody and it comes to trial and it turns out that witness was false witness, then they need to be punished. It's no surprise to me that then in the stories of Jesus Christ's ministry, when they asked him, what are the laws that bind us? He says, well, and he cites some of the 10 commandments, not all of them, but he sure put some emphasis on don't bear false witness. None of this is surprising to me. This is the kind of truth, important sense of justice that that any group of people would have encountered by just having to interact with each other and having to deal with that one jerk who makes false claims about other people. Why is God necessary in that equation?
I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. I'll admit it.
Well, that's super fair. Well, one fair answer is none of us would exist if there weren't God. Let's just go ahead and say that. Yeah.
I mean, I do take the presuppositional position on that, but to answer the question, the specific question you're talking about, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think that sentiment actually kind of captures everything. I mean, it's sort of where we differ in our positions, and how I think that, it's nice a conversation like this, we can sort of come to understand each other's positions better. But I still think we're going to walk away kind of feeling the same way about it. I honestly understand as best I can, and which is limited. But respect wholeheartedly the fact that when you look at the world, you go, well, this makes sense to me because God created this world. And it makes sense that there would be these regularities. It would make sense that we would be created in a fashion that it would become important to us that we don't lie to each other about each other. That makes sense to you. And at the same time, it makes sense to me that over 13.8 billion years, some of those clumps of stuff are going to stick together and cool, and there's going to be molecules, and they're going to form self-replicating molecules. And over the next, 4 billion years, there's going to be critters with legs that walk around, and then some of those are going to start talking to each other, and we've got to have conversations about whether or not we're supposed to lie to each other about each other, right? We end up coming to the same place with the same set of beliefs, and yet the foundation is just so incredibly different. I think the thing that I think I understand you guys when you say these things, that God is necessary for these things. I just don't agree with it. But I do fear sometimes that you guys look at our point of view about why the universe or how the universe becomes the way it is, and you just say, well, that doesn't make sense. And I don't know. It's frustrating sometimes. Sometimes you can't just say, well, like who's better at playing pool? Well, let's you and I play 10 games of pool, and whoever wins, we'll just say that was the better person. Sometimes you go, well, who's right about this God thing? Well, I don't know. Well, do you want to bump the topic a little bit? Do you have something to add to that, or do you want to bump the topic? And second, how much time? I think we've been at it over 2 hours. I think this has been I think it's been fun and helpful for both of us, and hopefully it's been helpful to the building audience. But
right now, what I'm doing right now is taking a look at the Hammurabi Code, and I noticed something that's a little interesting. Now, I'm not sure if indeed I have to properly interpret all the information that I'm seeing, but based upon what I'm reading, Hammurabi seems to mention God a few times, and
oh yeah, it's wildly spiritual. Yeah.
So
whether it's tied to I don't think it's at all tied. Let me just look up the date here. I don't think it's at all tied to the Christian God, but I mean they certainly. I'm saying other cultures. I mean the Chinese believed in gods. I mean it's not the ancient Chinese believed in gods. The modern Chinese, most of them believe in one god or many gods. Christianity is wildfire in China right now.
What I'm saying is that based on what I'm seeing here, is that it may seem like that Hammurabi and his particular culture were heavily influenced by Judaism, by Old Testament Judaism. So if that's the case, then of course there you have it right there, the influence of the Judeo-Christian perspective leading to that. Otherwise, that's what I would say. If that is the case, that's what I'm trying to look into to make sure I'm properly representing the Hammurabi Code.
You know what? You've got me energized to do that too, because I'm looking at the date. So they say to about 70. I mean, at the earliest Hammurabi, like the middle, so-called the era of middle chronology, 1754 BC, that would be on par with about when a lot of historians say that the parts of the Old Testament were constructed. I mean, there are people who say, by the way, that the Old Testament is as old as 3000 BC. Which is not a position that I would accept or that anyone would find me easy to convince of that for a variety of reasons. But it sounds like we're within a few hundred years either way. Like which came first, the Mosaic Law or the Code of Hammurabi? That's an interesting question, because I think then legitimately you could say that the Code of Hammurabi was influenced by by the Mosaic writings, which I wish, and I bet you somebody who's watching this or is going to watch this on YouTube subsequently is going to say, well, why didn't HogTie know that? I'm not an expert on the, and please, if you post a comment on the video itself or send me email, HogTieChamp@gmail.com, and educate me on this, because it was my understanding the Code of Hammurabi actually predates the Mosaic texts, the Pentateuch and things like that. But quite willing to acknowledge that I could be quite wrong about that.
Okay. Now I'm reading from an article from GotQuestions.org. It's a Christian apologetic website, so just at least let you know what position they're coming from. Not to say that they're not objective, but to let you know they do start with the foundation of the Bible.
They look it up though, yeah.
Okay. From GotQuestions.org, it says, does Moses copy the law from the Code of Hammurabi? Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who reigned from 1795 to 1750 BC. He is remembered today for promoting and enforcing an organized code of laws. The Code of Hammurabi, discovered on a stele in 1901, is one of the best preserved and comprehensive ancient writings of significant length ever found. The Hammurabian Code is divided into 12 sections and consists of 282 laws, 34 of which are unreadable. The code is basically a case-by-case formula of customary law covering administrative, civil, and criminal issues. The complexity of the laws and their subject matter reveal much about ancient Babylonian culture. About 300 years after Hammurabi, in 1440 BC, Moses recorded the law for the Israelites. Because the Mosaic law contains some similarities to the Hammurabi Code, some critics of the Bible believe that Moses copied the Hammurabian Code. If they're right, and Moses simply stole from the Babylonians, then the whole episode at Mount Sinai is false, and the inspiration of Scripture is suspect. Both Levitical law and Hammurabi codes impose the death penalty in cases of adultery and kidnapping. Also, there are similarities in the law of retaliation, such as an eye for an eye. Statute 206 of the Hammurabian Code says, if during a quarrel one man strikes another and found him, then he shall swear, if during a quarrel one man strikes another and wound him, then he shall swear, I did not injure him wittingly, and pay the physicians. The law of Moses is comparable, which says, if people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. There are other examples, but in all truth, such resemblances do not demonstrate that Moses plagiarized the Hammurabian Code. What the similarities show is that murder, theft, adultery, kidnapping are problems in every society and must be addressed. Even today, countries throughout the world have similar laws. Such parallels don't prove plagiarism. Similarity in penal codes should be expected in civil societies. Both Babylon and Israel had laws against murder, but it does not follow that one stole the idea from the other. Should one country not prosecute a crime simply because another country has a similar law? The difference between the Mosaic law and the Hammurabian Code are equally significant. For example, the law of Moses went far beyond the Code of Hammurabi in that it was rooted in the worship of one God supreme over all. The moral principles of the Old Testament are based on a righteous God who demanded that mankind created in his image live righteously. The law of Moses is more than a legal code. It speaks of sin and responsibility to God. So there is that sense of accountability, to answer your objection earlier. The Hammurabian Code and other ancient laws do not do this. So
okay, well, you know what? First off, yeah, I'm glad you looked that up. That was actually helpful, because, and by the way, yeah, I'm getting this. It's not even people waiting to watch this later and then send me email telling me I'm a dummy. A lot of it's pointed at me. We're both getting beat up in the live chat here. Everybody's insisting without source. I'm glad you went and you found a source that went and did some research on it. At least everybody's insisting. Tyler, who else was the Trevor, Tyler, Wolf King, like everybody's telling me, you guys should know, obviously Hammurabi predates the Bible. But while you guys were posting that stuff, Baptist was actually looking it up. He did go to a Christian apologetics website, but it is sourced. And I think he's acknowledging that it was written first. But I think the point of that article, and something I would agree with, it doesn't mean that one copied from the other, right? But it does mean that it is something that people can discover, right? It's something like the idea about we shouldn't steal from each other. Like if you lived in a society, it was perfectly acceptable to just, if you wanted something, just go take it. Then each individual has to have their doors locked, has to, I don't know, protect themselves in some way, and you can never be sure you're gonna have your property. Or the other view is if you say, well, let's make a rule, then set up some punishment and methods to catch people, then but those such of discoveries happen anytime you get people who live together as a society and they have some communication. They're going to, these things would be as your country's authors, framers had put it, a self-evident truth, right? So the idea that Moses, let's put it this way: the whole idea that Moses had to be told by a God in whatever form that people shouldn't covet, that people shouldn't steal, that these other things, that to me is not credible. And even through whatever means Moses had documented those things, whether he if you believe Moses was an actual person, but I mean, obviously there was a first author to those the Ten Commandment stories. There was an author to that, whether you want to believe that was Moses or otherwise. There was somebody who wrote that. Whether he copied it from Hammurabi or was culturally influenced or whatever else, or they discovered it independently, whatever, pick your poison, because neither of those things speak to the reality of God sitting Moses down. I know, not literally sitting down, but said, Moses, I got to talk to you about this. And I got to write this stuff down. You got to take this message down to the people because they'd be lost without it. Right? Well, it was already in the Code of Hammurabi, most of those things, and every other culture that was completely independent of the Bible.
Okay.
Let me put it this way. Here's a thought that's going to turn it a little bit, and then please, we should enforce a time limit on each other. We'll probably do this again, and it's more fun when we don't walk away with just a blistering headache because we talk for hours without remembering to get a drink of water. But here's one of the ideas I've been kicking around the last few months, is the idea about discoverability of something, right? So let's take some idea, and if I ask you, well, what's the source for that? Like, where did you first hear about this? And then let's play this game where you say, well, let's pretend that thing doesn't exist, right? So, for example, the idea that the Earth is round. If I ask you, why do you believe that? I don't know if Arcane Logos would hear, he would say, oh, it's because there were globes in the classroom. Well, you know what? We could imagine a world where there are no globes in the classroom. There are still ways that you would have discovered that the Earth is round. Or maybe you had one of your parents when you were very young told you that the campfire is hot. Well, let's suppose that person never told you the campfire was hot. Surely you would have discovered it eventually. That is, what I'm saying here is that there's some beliefs that you can make an initial guess, and it can be bad. You can actually start with a bad initial guess. As long as you are open-minded and you're collecting your evidence with an eye towards, I want to know the truth of the matter, you will eventually encounter the truth, given enough time and effort. So, for example, the idea that the Earth, you could start your life believing that the Earth is round. I'm sorry. You could start your life believing that the Earth is flat, and that's a very intuitive thing. You look at it, it sure does look flat. And then nobody could ever tell you that it's round. But if you started making observations, you would discover it. You could throw out all the writings of Kepler and Da Vinci and just everybody. You could throw out all those writings. If we just lost all of human knowledge and now we're just a bunch of dummies stumbling around not knowing anything, we would eventually rediscover that the Earth is round, even if we initially believed it was flat mistakenly.
Mm-hmm.
And something like the idea that society's better off when we don't steal from each other, we could throw out Hammurabi, Mosaic Law, all the Bibles, all the Quran, all the holy books, all the constitutions of every country, all the law books. We could get rid of it all and just start all over again as a bunch of warring morons. And over time, we would rediscover this idea that stealing from each other causes a lot of problems. Let's make a rule against it.
Right? Well, here's the problem that you would have.
Just real quick, just to understand my point. So do you understand that part of it? Because I actually haven't made the point I wanted to make, but I apologize, I'm long-winded. But you agree that there are some ideas that when they're true, it doesn't matter if you're told them, eventually they're out there to be discovered, right? Go ahead and make your point, though. But
I was just going to say, if you toss out all the law books in the world, you essentially have, what essentially take place is that you have to it begs the question then, what's to say that you or even the general population has any reason to say, okay, stealing is wrong, murdering is wrong, all this other stuff is just morally wrong. If indeed you want to reject the God of the Bible and reject his revelation, what's the standard by which you're able to apply and say, okay, well, if you want to take the worldview that God does not exist, there's no reason, no rhyme for us being here, then it begs the question, what's the purpose of me wanting to live a moral life? What's the point of me wanting to do right by you or right by society as opposed to doing what's right by me, or what I want to do?
Okay, I was going a whole different direction with that, but I like yours better. You know what? Because I sort of threw that out there too, and you're going back. Let's touch on that about the idea of accountability. What's the point? What's the point of having any morality anyway? What's the point of having a moral system? I think it gets to be pretty obvious. Like as I say, when you live in a society, these are things that those societies are better off. But you're mentioning things like accountability, so I want to pick up that point that I was saying before about that Christianity, this modern evangelical Christianity, creates a system where there's literally no moral accountability. There's simply no accountability for your actions. And you did say at the time that you were going to strenuously object to that, and I totally see why. But let's pick that up because you're saying, well, without the Christian God, why would people care? Why don't people just go ahead and be selfish? I'm telling you, there are obvious reasons, and I'm not going to lay them all out because I think that you see them as obvious too, right? That obviously, like in my life, if I decided I'm going to just start, murdering my neighbors, I'm not going to get very far because I do live in a society where, so there's obvious worldly incentives for it. But so I can answer it that way. But then when I say, well, then why do you, Baptist, live in a theology that establishes literally no accountability for your actions?
I must honestly disagree and say, no, that's not the case at all. There is the accountability that if I live this way is a demonstration that I simply don't know Christ. I have not come to salvation in him. That's one. And two, the fact of the matter is there is eternal punishment waiting for me when I pass on from this life. If indeed I reject Christ and want to live what sort of sinful life I want to live.
No. Hold on. I'm not talking about rejecting Christ. Nobody wants to reject Christ. That would be bad. I'm saying that because what I'm doing is I'm going to characterize your worldview this way. You're telling me, HogTie, here's what you need to do. You need to stop rejecting Christ. You need to accept Christ. I said, okay, Baptist, I'm with you there. Now, in terms of anything else I do, I steal. I tell lies about people. I don't have to worry about that because there's no accountability for that. That's what I'm getting at. Right. So that's what I'm saying of your life. Your view of your life is you do not reject Christ. You do accept Christ. So now there is no accountability for anything else. Now you can do anything.
No, that's not what the Bible teaches. The evidence that a person really has come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior is that the very character and the very person is changed from the inside out, and they want to do that which is good. Not for the sake of just merely surviving, but for the sake of it actually being absolute moral good by virtue of who God himself is.
Yeah, but they don't. And that's in the Bible too. Just because, you've got a whole bunch of things. Have you ever, you've been a believer, a genuine follower of Christ for as long as I've known you. Have you had an angry thought in that time? Have you had a bit of a dirty thought?
We're not talking about
perfection. You always say we're not talking about perfection. Okay, so it does. So you do sin. You not sin. You do go against God's law. Okay, but are you going to be consequences for that? That is eternal consequences, ultimate, absolute consequences. Are you going to burn in hell for those misdeeds?
Well, that brings us to the gospel, the fact that Christ paid the price for our sins already. The fact
so there is no. Okay, sorry.
Well, there are consequences. For example, there are consequences in the natural sense where whenever we lie, there are consequences that way. But we do have the conscience that tells us that it's morally wrong by virtue of who God himself is. And there is a consequence. For example, our relationships suffer for it. Our own personal relationship with God does suffer for it. And there is a genuine conviction that it is morally wrong. And we ought to turn from that and live better life and live according to what God commands.
Hang on. I'm going to grant myself permission to interrupt there because now you're listing things that are again, you're just absolutely pillaging my worldview. And I'm going to say that partly is a joke, but because of this weird claim that anyway, no, now you're listing things that I would list. You're listing all the secular concerns. Yes, there are problems. If you get caught lying, yes, it hurts your relationships. Yes, it hurts my relationships. Try to give me an example of something that isn't already in my tool set for making moral decisions. So you mentioned worldly, the It can be physical implications, worldly implications, relationship implications, all those things. Yes, I get it. But in terms of the consequences for those actions, what in your worldview is a consequence for your misdeeds that is not a consequence for misdeeds in my worldview?
Well, the difference between I'll admit it, the difference between a born again believer is that their sins have already been paid for. They're on their way to heaven. But the fact that their nature has been changed, they do have that grief, that sorrow that what they've done is morally, objectively, and universally and eternally wrong against God himself. And they must turn from that and do right and do better by God, first and foremost, and secondly, by their fellow man. So the idea that I'm not sure. Well, let me ask this question. What do you mean by accountability? What are you essentially trying to hint at when you say accountability? Maybe if I ask that question, I'll better understand where you're getting at.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's a good idea. What I'm getting at is I guess I'm saying it in response to an accusation that I've heard, or a statement I've heard you say before, although in all fairness, you haven't said it in this hangout, so it leaves it a little bit untethered. So I appreciate you asking that. Is the idea you'll say, well, what drive is there for a non-believer to be moral or be a good person or do these things? Because there's no ultimate consequences. There's just no ultimate consequences for it. You know, eventually the life on Earth is going to dry up and the sun's going to engulf the Earth and the universe is going to just go out into a big heat death, whatever, right? So what does it matter if you're nice people? And to use that phrase, there are no ultimate consequences. Is that a phrase you've used? Just to be fair.
I would disagree wholeheartedly. If you're talking about the unbeliever, essentially what's happening is that when they reject Christ and his gospel, and they simply say, I don't want anything to do with God, I don't want to live a moral or a good life, or I don't want to live according to God's commands. What essentially happens is that they're trying to reject any sense of ultimate accountability by rejecting God's good and holy nature and his commands, his requirements for them to indeed be reformed in their character, in their person, in order to live according to what he commands in his word. So what happens there is that the ultimate accountability, the ultimate punishment for the unbeliever, both in this life, in some, I'll admit, to some degree, not necessarily to the umpteenth degree, where suddenly fire is going to come out of heaven and consume them so suddenly, but the fact that when they die and they pass on without having come to true and saving faith in Christ and demonstrated that life or demonstrated fruits of walking in God's good and holy righteous character, they're essentially going to end up suffering under God's wrath and judgment in hell for eternity. That's what the Bible teaches. Now, for the Christian, they have that strong conscience by virtue of God's law, God's good law and his commandments written on their minds and hearts, which does sort of reform them and places that obligation to do right by him and by their fellow man. That's the difference.
There's no obligation. There's no. If there's an obligation, there's no enforcement of it. There may be a promise or a commitment, but for example, so you have this personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. In that relationship, you do commit yourself to a moral and a good life, mm-hmm. right? But you don't. I mean, you commit to it, but you don't do so perfectly. You still transgress against the law that's in your heart, right?
Okay. Yes. What happens with a believer is that they're not going to live perfectly, but the overall trajectory of their life is to grow in being more Christ-like in their character. That's what happens.
Right. But you don't. If they don't.
So you're saying a person does not become more Christ-like?
No, they become better. We all do, right? I mean, so again, this is for convenience because you and me, we're both here, so we'll talk about us. We are both gentlemen who were probably pretty good people when we were younger, and we've gotten better, but we're not as good as we are today as we're going to be tomorrow. And even at that, hold on. Even at that, neither of us will ever be perfect in this lifetime, right? Is that a fair characterization?
Well, what's your standard of perfect, or?
Well, by whatever standard, it doesn't matter what. If you just think about it, I mean, just name a standard. I mean, neither you or I are going to live up to moral perfection under my moral view, right? Where my moral view relates to harms and benefits to sentient creatures, right? Neither of us are ever going to be perfect. We're going to make missteps. We're going to make bad judgments. We're going to be in a bad mood someday and do something unkind that we really wish we hadn't done, right? So neither you or I are going to live up to perfection to my moral standard, right?
Well, again, it depends on whose standard you're using.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't depend on that at all, because it doesn't matter what moral standard you list, right? The moral standard is going to be some ideal And even if we word it differently, there's going to be some ideal out there, and we're human beings, so we make mistakes. It doesn't matter what the moral standard is. You and I are not going to live our whole lives living to perfection to that moral standard.
Again, I would have to just staunchly disagree and say I'm afraid that's incorrect. If you do have that objective, universally applicable standard by which we do have through the scriptures, then you could pretty much start defining good and evil as anything, So I would definitely have to say in regards to what the Bible teaches and what it means to actually do good or actually be perfect. Of course, we as Christians, we all as human beings fall short terribly.
Yes.
So, but of course, for the Christian, they do make that overall trajectory towards being more that way and growing and knowing Christ and loving him and serving him and being that loving and compassionate example, like a Christ-like example to their fellow man. So.
Yeah, it's all for naught. This is what I'm getting at. Is it doesn't matter because we're never going to be perfect, right? I mean, so first off, let's pick the moral standard that's established in what you would describe as the Christian worldview, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, for simplicity, being Christ-like. You will never be Christ-like. You are more Christ-like than you were, and you're going to be more Christ-like tomorrow. But you will never be Christ-like. I am more Christ-like than I was 20 years ago, but not as Christ-like as I will be in the future. Just use that term Christ-like as a label for that stuff. But I will never be perfect. You will never be perfect. I will never be perfect. Neither one of us will ever achieve perfection under that Christian standard, right? That we just have to agree on, or you disagree with the Bible.
No, right? I would agree that now, of course, no one's going to reach that perfect standard. However, what I would say with the unbeliever, let me put it this way. The main difference between the believer and the unbeliever is that we have that absolute standard, that universal objective standard by which.
That's not a difference. I got to interrupt you because that's not a difference.
Again,
I do have an objective standard.
Allow me to.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
This one, by which the Christian does indeed adhere to and grow in over time. So, in regards to, and the reason why I say this is because for the unbeliever, what ends up happening is that there's also, as you can see, even in our culture, there's all sorts of justification for all sorts of deviancy, all sorts of nonsensical ideas that deviated from the traditional ideas of America's founding that were heavily influenced by the Christian worldview.
No, I'm sorry. This will be interruption worthy because now you're going off into a whole discussion about other people doing deviant things or whatever else. I agree. Yeah, there are people in the world who do deviant things. Mm-hmm. There are people who do things that I would consider to be deviant where they think that that's totally cool. They made a different assessment than me. There are people who do things that I would consider deviant and they themselves know that they're wrong. Like a lot of thieves, when they steal, they know that it's wrong to steal, but they still do it. That's all different topics. It's all different topics. Let's just talk about the idea about there being consequences for your actions. So there are deeds and there are misdeeds, and are there ultimate consequences for these things?
There are consequences, yes, according to the scripture. There are consequences.
No, not according to your theology. I mean, there might be according to your to scripture, but they're certainly not according to your theology.
What are you talking about?
I can lay that out for you. About ultimate consequences. I'm saying you are going to fall short of your moral standard. I fall short of my own moral standard. I don't know why that was a point in dispute a while ago. If I set a moral standard, just to digress for a little bit, but if I were to say my moral standard is always do good things and never do harm. Do as much good as possible. Do as little harm as possible. Okay, great. That sets my standard. Now that's how I'm going to proceed in my life. Do you think I'm going to be perfect at that? You think you're going to be perfect at that? Nobody's going to be perfect at that.
Well, what do you define as this thing is good, this thing is bad? What are you using?
Well, benefits and harms. The fourth time, the benefits and harms. Benefits and harms to sentient creatures. There's very different ways that can be worded, but rather than bogging down to a discussion about that, you know what I mean when I say it. Whatever wording you want, something to do with, like, morality is defined in terms of benefits and harms to sentient creatures. Specifically, the moral choice is the one that increases the benefits, serves to decrease the harms to sentient creatures.
Well, I define that, with the Old and New Testament, as you very well know. So you and I can have very staunchly different ideas. So that's why I'm asking, what is that standard you're pulling from? That's where the staunch disagreement between you and I really comes. I'm not trying to be disingenuous. I'm being I'm being as very straightforward as I can with you all, and very honest based upon my theology with you on this.
Okay. Well, I think we're part of the problem, and unfortunately, I was not able to sort of make the point I wanted to make a while ago about the consequences. I hope we do get back to it, and maybe that'll be a point that we close on. But I guess let me pick up a thread that you and Chris have discussed an awful lot, and that is this idea about the non-believers not having a basis for their morality. In fact, let's do this. Let's call this almost like a new chapter where this will be weird. Let's start our whole conversation on this point about there being a foundation. I hear this a lot in the CARM room. Veckel, for example, is somebody who will say, well, what do you expect from somebody who has no basis for his morality? That's literally the phrase he uses, no basis. If you ask him about it, he will always say, what I meant to say was no objective basis for morality. That is, Veckel will always say, if you don't believe in the Christian God, then you maybe have a basis for your morality, but it's going to be subjective and what's the other word? Arbitrary, right? I disagree with that. I think that's just a head in the sand mischaracterization of how moral reasoning works. Because yes, of course I do have an objective standard for my moral reasoning, and that is harms and benefits. Now, it is true that because we're fallible creatures, when we need to make assessments of harms and benefits, we're imperfect at making those assessments. But your stated objective moral standard has the same flaw. You do have an objective moral standard on your telling of it, but as a fallible human, you can still make mistakes in making assessments, just the way that I do when I do my level best to assess harms and benefits of the consequences of my actions.
The difference between you and I is that whenever you use the definition of objective morality, it still ends up being more of a subjective basis. However, what I'm pulling from is the very person of God himself, who is the very definition of what is good. So if you want to say, okay, harms and benefits, well, whose definition of harms and benefits? You know, are you using your own subjective, or are you trying to use?
No. It's not about. Sorry. You keep saying the difference between you and me, or the difference between our positions on this is, and then you insert something that is actually not a difference. You end up citing something that's actually identical between the two. The one difference between our moral views when we construct morality is that your moral view inserts a unproven being at the top of all this, and then you say, well, it's the character of that being that defines right and wrong. So it's just this other kludge. It's this little piece that gets stuck on, and now you have no definition for what's good or bad. You literally have, when you do it that way, you literally have no way to define what is meant by good or bad, because you're saying it is the things that are good are those things that are consistent with God's character. The things that are bad are those things that are inconsistent with God's character.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, how about, here's my moral system. Those things that are good are those things that are consistent with Fleably's character. Those things that are bad, Fleably.
Who on God's green earth is that?
If you know Fleably, then you know what is good and what is bad. Because good and bad are defined as consistent and inconsistent with Fleably's character. So now, if my neighbor is struggling moving multiple loads of groceries from her car to her house, should I go help her move her groceries? Well, that depends if that's consistent with Fleably's character or not. So what I've done is I've now created a moral system that has literally no definitions to it, because I'm appealing to a non-existent entity, and I'm saying that, well, it's whatever that non-existent entity's character says.
You're presupposing that God does not exist. That's the problem. You already have that position.
It's not required. Fleably could have been the creator of God. Fleably could be something that was created by God. Fleably could have been something that evolved or appeared, or it could be outside the universe, whatever. Right? It doesn't matter. Okay. All I'm saying is whatever Fleably is and however Fleably came to be, it's Fleably's character that defines good and bad. When I need to make a moral choice, I need to ask myself, well, what would Fleably do? You see how you see it? Hold on a second. My question is, and you go ahead and make your point, but do you see how that definition of morality means you now have no definition for morality?
You're literally calling upon an imaginary being in order to try and use this, when the fact of the matter is, with us, we do have the evidence that God has revealed himself and he has spoken. That's a stark difference between you and I on this issue.
Well, okay. I can even grant I can even grant that God exists. God was created by feebly, or feebly created God, whichever, doesn't matter. I can concede that God exists. I can say, well, look, I don't. Sure, you have evidence. Sure, God exists. Whatever. How does that help you make moral decisions?
We have the very nature and character of this God, the triune God, Yahweh, recorded for us and demonstrated in Scripture. So we have the evidence right there from Genesis to Revelation.
Okay, so then all you get then is, at that point now, all you're giving yourself is God is the Bible. The Bible is God.
Well, when the Bible speaks, God Himself is speaking. I'm not saying God is the Bible. We're saying God has spoken, and we know this through what the Bible teaches.
No. Well, first off, if you say, well, Scripture is the ultimate guidance.
Yes, because it's the very voice of God Himself. It's not God Himself in the sense of it's not His very being, but however, His being is communicated. His very person is communicated through Scripture. We're able to do that.
Okay, well, let's try this then. Let's try. I mean, I still wish you could kind of see the point that when you say that morality is that which is consistent with some character, that is not a definition for morality, right? And I still want to get back to the consequences, but okay, let's take this path then. So, if suppose that in your personal relationship with Jesus, you were commanded to take a sword and to strike the belly of a pregnant woman. Is the right thing to do? Is that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do to follow that command?
You're talking about the literal person of Christ appearing before me and commanding us to do that very thing.
Well, however he could communicate it to you. It's a thought in your head. It's a voice. It's a physical appearance. Whatever it is, God could do it, right? God could appear before you. God could put that thought in your head, right?
If you're talking about the very nature, if you're talking about the very God of the Bible, you're dealing with something that you're essentially dealing with something that's a bit contradicting. It's not consistent with the nature and character of God Himself. It's talking about just randomly striking a pregnant woman.
I didn't say randomly. It's expressly not randomly. This woman, there's the woman. Go do it. It didn't say, well, go pick a random woman. He says, this woman. There's a woman. In fact, there's 8 of them over there. Go do all 8 of them.
God always gave justification for why He commanded the Israelites to do those killings. And you know what you're trying to get at. You're talking about the ancient Israelites and the fact that they went about and fought against other cultures and essentially annihilated them. But what the problem is, God always gave the reason why He was commanding this, and it was always consistent with His nature and character. For example, with the Canaanites, they were literally killing innocent babies and children on the golden altar of Moloch. And they were beating their drums and making all sorts of celebration noises to drown out the sounds of their literal screaming and horror and pain and torment. So you're talking about 2 different things entirely.
Okay, well then whatever. So hold a sec. You would not follow the command unless God gave you a justification that was acceptable to your reasoning.
I wouldn't have to wait for what's one looking for. I wouldn't have to wait or try to what's one looking for. I wouldn't have to sort of wait for it. God always gives it. God always gives it.
Okay, so now, okay, hold on a sec. Have you ever felt convicted to preach? I don't. We keep going all these little meandering trails. I want you to sort of get one of these points here. So you're saying, hold on a second. You're saying that if God asked you to do something, you would do so only if God packaged it with justification.
Again, we run into the same point. God always gave it, so I would always trust that He would provide He'd always provide sufficient reason for why He's commanding us to do one thing or the next.
Okay, but let's say you don't get that sufficient reason. If God says, "Okay, go do this. Go kill those 8 pregnant women," what do you do then? You go do it. You don't do it.
It wouldn't be the nature and character of God.
But okay, of course it would be, because that has happened. You just acknowledged moments ago that has happened. It's not even an arbitrary example. Like if I say, well, God says to go fly in a spaceship and blow up Jupiter, right? Okay, well, that's never happened. I've never known God to do that. You're familiar with stories of God ordering specifically the slashing of pregnant women's bellies. So that's not even an arbitrary example. That's a real one from the biblical history. So if you're there, okay, well, do you do it?
Well, from there during the time of the Israelites?
Sure, okay, we'll do that example, yeah.
Like when God actually appeared to Moses and said the Israelites, the Canaanites are killing innocent children and taking innocent children and babies from their mothers. Therefore, according to my holy character, go take them out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something completely different.
Okay, so God says, so now you're presenting it this way. God says, okay, we need you people to go over there and kill those people, and make sure you get the pregnant ones. And then they're like, oh, I don't know. Yeah, and then they go, okay, but because God's like, hang on a sec. God's like, hang on, guys, hang on. I'm going to give you the reason. And then they listen to the reason and they went, okay, good point, God. We're going to go do that. Is that the way it works?
That's usually how God does it.
And people listen to the reason and they decide, okay, sounds like God has a good reason here. Let's go do it.
No, God makes it. We'll put it this way: God reveals that it is indeed it is necessarily consistent with His holy nature and character. He constantly has done that whenever He commanded the Israelites to go kill this nation or go fight against this nation, or whenever Jesus even told the disciples to go do something. He always gave the reason for it.
Okay. Well. So the reason stated, you mentioned about them, throwing the babies in the fires and Moloch and all that other stuff. So let's say it happens now, and he says, okay, look, there's a woman downstairs, pregnant. I'm going to, I don't know where you live, but I'm going to say you live in an apartment building. The woman who lives downstairs from you, she's quite an advanced stage of pregnancy, a couple weeks away from having a baby. Yeah. That baby will ultimately grow up to be one of the most prolific abortion doctors in the country, and will actually develop a new technique for doing it that will make it just so simple that there will literally be millions of fetuses that die because of this. And I can't have that. I just simply cannot have that. So you, Baptist702, I need you to go get something and deal with that fetus for me. Off you go. So now you've been given a morally sufficient reason, even more so than the attack on the Canaanites. So now you've been given your moral, and you sit and you think, okay, yes, God makes a good point there. I'm going to go do this. Is that what you do? Then you do it because now you've been given a reason?
Well, it seems consistent with the nature and character of God, so I would say, yeah.
You know what? Honestly, I don't have a next thing to say that, because I've had that sort of a discussion with people before. I've never once had a Christian tell me, oh, okay, well, as long as there's a good reason, yes, I would go stab the pregnant woman. I've never had someone say that. Are you sure? If this were a game of chess, I would let you take that move back. You literally, if God came to you and told you a reason that in your judgment was a good reason to go stab a pregnant woman, you would go stab a pregnant woman. Is that actually what you're saying?
I'm not saying in my moral reason. I'm saying it is consistent with the nature and character of God Himself. God who indeed hates. God who hates.
Yeah.
And the God who hates the idea of someone just unjustly taking the life of other people, or the fact that God is always about trying to save lives, or trying to help lives prosper based upon His good and holy character, things of that nature. We would essentially be all about trying to defend life as much as humanly possible.
Okay, let me tell you what I think I've learned here. Okay, I'll tell you what I think I've learned here. First off, I do not believe that I've learned that you would stab a pregnant woman under any circumstances. You said that you would, and I'm going to give you credit, and I'm going to tell you I literally do not believe you. Knowing you for the time that I have, we don't know each other that well, but I cannot believe of you that the thing you just said of yourself is actually true of yourself. No part of you could muster that. And I understand you said I know you know how to kill people. I know that you have a job that under some circumstances it may come down to that. And I know I'm not making light here, because I know that that's a struggle. I know that is something that you have to weigh with your humanity, with your Christianity, and with a sense of justice. I know that's a difficult job. I understand that. I'm not making light of that. But what I'm saying is that you don't have in you, even whatever you've been taught, and even the rigidity of that difficult situation, there is nothing in you that could make you hear a voice, grab a knife, and go stab a pregnant woman. That's just not you. I cannot believe that of you. Okay, so that's one thing I just find weird that you even said that. But here's the other thing I learned about you that I do believe is true. Your final authority in moral reasoning is you. Because every time I ask you this question, you'll say, well, consistent with God. But I have to choose whether or not it's consistent with God. I have to look at the Bible and make an assessment about it. I have to decide whether God has a morally sufficient reason. And then when I point that out to you, you say, no, 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 no. It's not up to me to assess whether God has a morally sufficient reason. But then the very next question I answer, or I ask you, you then respond by saying, well, as long as he has a good reason. Well, what if God just said, go stab the pregnant woman and don't worry about it? I do have a morally sufficient reason. I'll explain later. You'd be like, okie dokie. Like, is that, no, you make your choices based on your reasoning about your circumstances and your sense of compassion for humanity and your sense of justice. I don't actually believe of you that you really, that your morals actually come from a book. I think you're a better person than that.
Well, what do you determine by better whenever you make that charge?
Benefits and harms. Benefits and harms to sentient creatures.
That can mean anything to people who essentially don't have the foundation in God and His Word.
Well, okay. You keep doing that. That's an escape hatch. Let's try to close that escape hatch for you here. Because what you're doing is you're pointing out every time you say that about, well, you may look at something and come up with a different assessment than me. Well, that's true of everything, right? It's like, I'm going to use an example that Sam Harris has popularized, because I think it's such a darn good one. We have a similar sentiment, similar notion of what health is, right? We know that having a bag of rocks dropped on your head from 20 feet is bad for your health, right? We know that smoking is bad for your health. We know that having lots of exercise and a diverse diet is good for your health. Neither one of us could really come up with a perfect definition of what health is. And neither one of us would be able to look at what someone's doing, look at them and say, well, that person's eating a sandwich. Is that good for their health or bad for their health? We wouldn't have accurate information. We would make misjudgments about health. But the fact that people have different subjective impressions about what the health consequences are for something doesn't mean that there simply isn't a notion of health, right? Do you see what I mean? That just because there may be differences of opinion doesn't mean that health is just a higgledy-piggledy concept that just doesn't mean anything to anybody, and it's totally subjective. Health is an objective thing. There are things that lead to improved health and things that lead to decreases in good health. And just because we have different subjective assessments of what consequences might be doesn't mean that health is therefore not a thing. It's a thing, isn't it? Same thing for benefits and harms to people, right? There are difficulties. We have to make assessments. When we look at something and say, well, is that a benefit or is that a harm? We subjectively, with our imperfect information, we might come to different opinions. But it doesn't mean that there's no notion of benefits or no notion of harms. Okay, I just think you should accept that. I mean, that to me is a very plain point. The point that it would be more difficult for you to accept, although I'm going to tell you I'm 100% right about this, is that you have the same problem with Christianity. As soon as you say I have an objective moral standard, and that is to do God's will, to stay consistent with God's character, you still have that subjective assessment problem. You and another believer, with whatever information you have, will still, so you got a difficult decision to make. Should I do X or should I do Y? And you meet with some of your fellow believers. Some of them are going to say, well, you're going to say, well, which should I do? They're all going to agree, well, you should do the one X or Y. You should do the one that is consistent with God's character. You should not do the one that is inconsistent with God's character. Yep, all agreed. Okay, now which one's consistent with God's character, X or with Y? And you'll discuss it, and you may come to differing opinions about it. Now, one of them truly is more consistent with God's character than the other, but in your subjective assessment of it, you're not going to, you might have differences of opinion about picking one over the other, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a God's character. You see, I'm putting those two things in exact parallel. When I talk about doing things to meet objectives related to benefits and harms, you point out that there's a subjectivity problem. How do I make those assessments perfectly? I don't make them perfectly. Well, then therefore that's stupid. I could equally say to you, because it's exactly on parallel, when you say I try to do things that are consistent with God's character, I say, well, how do you assess God's character? You say, well, subjectively and imperfectly. Well, then we throw that out the window too, because if you're going to throw out my sentiment of benefits and harms for that reason, then put in the same bag with it your notion about God's character. Because it's got the same problem. We're subjective humans making assessments. Does that make sense to you?
I'm afraid I must disagree with you on the notion that when you said earlier that, oh yeah, I think you're much better of a person than suddenly just saying, "Oh, God commanded you to kill or stab the pregnant woman, kill the baby," that you would somehow just randomly do it. My friend, you may say that, but if indeed it was God, if beyond a shadow of any reasonable doubt, God made it very clear that it was indeed Him speaking, then certainly I would follow through with the act. You may think I wouldn't do it, but my friend, we're talking about God making it clear who He is. And that is indeed foundationally based on His objective revelation, or God making it very clear through some extra biblical notion that it really is Him. But apart from that, my dear friend, the idea you're saying, oh, your benefits and harms, again, the fact that you don't have that foundation rooted in God, it could mean anything, because we have examples with Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, all these non-theistic regimes or atheistic regimes who tried to who end up killing millions of their own people, because they essentially had, when they reject the notion of God, somebody in the hierarchy had to take his place. But the problem was, what ended up happening with God, with rejecting God, even Friedrich Nietzsche pointed this problem out. There's no foundations of anything, up or down, left or right, good and evil, nothing. You pretty much lose definitions of life in and of itself, because it's not rooted in God, who has spoken and revealed Himself in Scripture. That's the problem.
I adore that your response to what I just said included Hitler, Stalin, Nietzsche. Like, you just went all over the. That's an incloud, I think it is. Like, you're not addressing the point that I'm making, right? And I hear the sincerity when you say that you would go ahead and stab a pregnant woman. I find that alarming. I find that on those rare occasions when somebody asks me, well, why would you ever go out and talk about atheism? Like, do you have a problem with Christianity? Some good comes from Christianity, but some really awful shit comes from Christianity. And that thing that you just said, that's some seriously awful shit. Because what you're saying is that if you come to the belief that a voice tells you to stab a pregnant woman, you'll stab a pregnant woman. And then you went to say that, well, because God would never tell us to do something that is objectively harmful, while ignoring the examples that you yourself raised in this hangout of things that God has done that is not in the interest of humanity. That you can say, well, He may have some morally sufficient reason unknown to us. But like, I want to stick with the stabbing the pregnant women thing, because what the heck is the rationale for that? You think that an omnipotent being can't come up with just scratching his head going, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with the Canaanites? Well, I guess I got to send some people over to start stabbing the bellies of the pregnant women. I just tapped out of ideas. That's the best moral choice that I can make. That's just baffling that a person would say that. So you do have, in your view, a divine creator that sees that as a solution to problems, that sort of bloody, malicious violence. Not a solution to a problem, not simply extracting somebody out so that they're not in that problem anymore, but going through with the most brutal, painful, harmful, malicious, bloody solution to a problem, and saying, well, he had a morally sufficient reason to do that. Well, I do take your point that he had a reason for wanting to deal with the situation. But like, okay, let's deal with your immigrant crisis, right? You guys have a problem. You got people coming across the border. There's drugs coming across the border. There are honest refugees just trying to get some help, and they're in the mix. And what the heck are we going to do about it? Well, here's what you can do. Why don't you go stab all the pregnant women? And if somebody says, well, no, we can't be stabbing pregnant women, you go, well, what? You don't want to deal with the immigrant crisis? Right? I understand when you say, well, the Canaanites were a problem, so we got to do something to deal with them. But was that the right thing to do to deal with them? Because I can come up with 7 better solutions off the top of my head. Probably 8 or 9 if I were also omnipotent and omniscient. Right? I mean, to me, that's crazy. And the fact that you would take some pride in announcing to me and people on YouTube that yeah, there are circumstances I'd go ahead and I'd stab that pregnant woman. If you were convinced, as every really deeply, Vincent Lee, right? Vincent Lee was a guy who was genuinely convinced that the guy on the bus, on the Greyhound, that young college student that was on the Greyhound bus, was a demonic force. And Vincent Lee was 100% convinced that God wanted him to deal with that demonic force. And the specific instruction was to take this knife, stab him repeatedly, pull pieces of flesh off the man's face, and sever his head from his body. And Vincent Lee did that with 100% confidence that this is what God wanted him to do. Well, Vincent Lee's in a facility and he got some medication, and about a week later he went, I was probably wrong about that. That's what God wanted, but I was pretty sure at the time. And this is what is alarming about this I guess I mean my whole point would be this, by the way, that if you want to know what I'm evangelical about, the things that I would preach, I would say try to make your beliefs comport with reality. We're fallible creatures, we make misjudgments, but as much as possible, try to learn about reality. And when it comes to moral choices, try to learn what is truly beneficial and what is truly harmful. We'll never be perfect at it, but get as good as you can be, because you are better for yourself, you're better for your family, you're better for your community when your beliefs comport with reality. And when your beliefs about the consequences of your moral choices comport with reality, you're going to be a much better person. Because there are other people out there who believe in God and they believe in Jesus, and generally speaking, that doesn't really bring being wrong about that. In my view, they're wrong about it. Being wrong about that generally isn't a harmful thing. As a matter of fact, it keeps a lot of people in the straight and narrow. Good for them. But there are some harms that come about from it, because when we have this culturally endorsed illusion of these supernatural forces, once in a while somebody goes crazy and they cut the head off of someone else on a Greyhound bus. That sort of thing happens. Now you're going to point to how atheism caused Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler, and I don't even want to address that. Do you want me to address that? Because you must know this. I mean, you're aware that atheism causes none of that stuff, right? I mean that's
None
ridiculous. None of it.
Okay, go ahead and demonstrate that, please.
Well, I would be, because you're the one who makes the claim. You'd actually be in the driver's seat in terms of bringing forth evidence. You're the one making the claim that that's caused by atheism, if that's your actual claim. I would like to see that connection. I would like to see where somebody says that, well, here's a point when somebody said, well, I'm an atheist, and now that I don't believe in God, think, now I need to kill 25 million people, right? Those motivations for killing people aren't because of their belief or lack in a belief in any sort of gods, including somebody like Hitler, who absolutely believed in many supernatural things. Top of the list, God and Jesus Christ. And then a smattering of a bunch of crazy stuff that, like, in my view, isn't even consistent with believing in God and Jesus Christ. But I don't know. Let's let Hitler do Hitler. I heard somebody say a while ago, there was one really good thing that Hitler did. There was one thing that they really respected about Hitler, one really good thing he did. And that was he killed Hitler. That's the only thing that anybody ever praises of what he did. But no, I mean, this idea that you can trot out Pol Pot and Stalin and then weirdly Hitler, who wasn't even an atheist, and say, well, look what atheism does. I don't know how in 2019, with YouTube being in place for almost 15 years now, that people can still think that's a sensible thing to say in a discussion. I mean, why would you think that's okay, here's my argument then. My argument would be those things, those atrocities are caused by the social forces, by the totalitarianistic need for a small group of people to unjustly rule over a large group of people. That's where the real fight is. I mean, honestly, if I could stand up and if I had any sort of force on the internet, if people listened to me at all, I wouldn't waste my time telling people not to believe in God or Jesus, because it really doesn't bother me that they believe in God and Jesus. I would want the world to rise up against autocracy and totalitarianism. That sort of social tyranny of a small group of people ruling over a large group of people. That's where humanity does evil to humanity. Not because they believe in a particular god or because they don't believe in any gods. I think both of those accusations are just plain silly. I don't know. I'm ranting now.
Well, admittedly, I am getting generally tired. Not so much as this conversation is good, but I'm physically just a little tired right now. So
I'm at the same place there. I was actually going to suggest that was sort of where we're gonna wrap it up. Can I make I'll tell you what, can I make one sort of anti-gospel comment, and then I would kind of like to end, if you can just muster a bit more energy for it. I would like you to think on an important point of gospel. Either something that just needs to be resaid no matter how many times we've heard it, or something that's new to us. Can I get you to wrap up on that point? And I apologize, I'm going to precede it by closing out a point I made earlier when I said about no consequences. This is the thing that I've been trying to point out to believers. I've never had one pick it up and say, oh, I see what you mean, HogTie, but I'm going to say it anyway for the benefit of my audience. Maybe they'll hear it, and then I think the rest of us will be happy to hear what you want to say about the virtues of having Christ in your life. And then I'd kind of like to end the hangout on that note. And I want to thank you again. Like, this has been so much fun, because you challenge me in a lot of places, right? Like, where I normally had a thing I say next, I'm like, no, actually what Baptist said was pretty reasonable there. That kind of hurt. Anyway, so here's why I say there are no consequences in Christianity. And it's because my understanding of the gospel message is that there are two types of people. At the end of this whole process, we're going to get shunted down one of two chutes, okay, for eternity, right? Now, down the one chute are going to be the evil, disgusting, dirty sinners who rejected Jesus Christ, and they're going to hell. Of course, in the other chute are going to be the evil, disgusting, dirty sinners who did accept Christ, and they go to heaven. So in my view, that having it explained that way, you thought I was going to say something else, didn't you? The fact that Christians themselves present Christianity to me as there are no good people. There is no one deserving of heaven. We all deserve death. But some of us are not going to get it. No matter, some of us are going to have eternal life of eternal bliss, even though we have those failings. And there are other people who tried really, really, really hard, but they're not going to go to heaven because they didn't join the club. To me, that is a moral system with literally no accountability, literally zero consequences for your actions, right? That's a system that says you're all headed for hell, but these people, like, who came to Christ, they're the ones who get eternal bliss. Everybody else gets eternal torment. That is once you present the gospel in that way, don't ever come back to me and say anything about consequences for actions. Don't ever come back and say, oh, atheists don't believe in there being ultimate consequences for their actions. Because in my view, you guys don't believe in eternal consequences for your actions. You believe in eternal consequences for one single choice, and that is to choose Jesus Christ over the rejection of Jesus Christ. That was my whole point about a half hour ago, that when I imagine we'll pick that up again in the future, that when I say that Christians actually push a point of view that has literally no consequences, literally no judgment, literally no accountability, that's what I meant by it. So I'm gonna now sort of endorse that, stamp that as being literally the worst. The thing I just said, literally the worst introduction to the gospel message ever. I want to invite you to go ahead and share any part of the gospel you want with a little bit of a smirk on my face, because I cannot believe that the thing I just said is going to be the thing right before you say what you're going to say. I apologize, and I hope that your fellow believers have a sense of humor about how incredibly bizarre of an introduction that was. That's not what I meant it to be, but yeah, that's how it played out.
My response would simply be this. The difference, yes, by all means, we all have fallen short of God's glory. And the actual choice to receive God's free gift of salvation, which does indeed save you and change you to actually do better from the inside out, not just merely want to do better for the sake of what's we're looking for, merely natural consequences or pragmatic consequences, but because of the spiritual consequences that comes from rejecting Christ and continuing to live in that sinful life, rejecting him. So I would staunchly disagree with you on that point, HogTie. There is a sense where if a person is growing and actually being Christ-like in their character, and I'm not just merely talking about doing good by their fellow man just for the sake of trying to get to heaven. I'm talking about because of who they are, because of Christ and the fact that he does change them from the inside out and makes them holy or holier, let me put it that way, growing in holiness, growing in Christ-likeness, growing in that essential goodness and purity and truth, not in perfection, but there's a genuine growth in that. And it's rooted in what the Bible teaches, rooted in sound biblical truth. There's a sign that these people, even though yes, they are undeserving of hell, the sign that they're on their way to heaven is by virtue of someone else's good deeds and works with someone else who paid the price for their sins. Because we as humanity cannot save ourselves by any good deeds or works at all. Because we are born sinners by our very nature. We're born with evil that has corrupted us, not to the umpteenth degree where this don't do any good deeds or works, but it has corrupted us to where any of our good deeds and works, unfortunately, comes from a corrupted source. So we need someone to save us and change us from the inside out, and that's what the Bible talks about, becoming born again. Yes, we do struggle with the sinful nature, and we're not going to be perfect, but the overall trajectory of a believer's life is to grow in truth and holiness and goodness and purity and righteousness. It's with that I do say this. And unfortunately, I must disagree and say that to those who do reject Christ, more often times than not, it has more disastrous and negative moral and evil consequences as opposed to those who do come to true and saving faith in Jesus Christ. It's with that I do say this. To those of you who do not know Jesus, to those of you who do reject him as your Lord and Savior, I must plead with you to please reconsider. Understand that God who is holy and just and good eternally, objectively, and has revealed this in scripture and nature, and all mankind knows this. This very same God, in the person of his eternal Son, Jesus the Christ, the Yeshua Mashiach, does command all men everywhere to repent of their sins and believe on the one who died to pay the price for their sins and make them brand new from the inside out. So it's with that I do plead with anyone under the sound of my voice to indeed repent and believe on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. It's with that I do appreciate the conversation we've had, HogTie, and I do pray that very same gospel message would bring you to salvation in Jesus Christ.
And I do appreciate that, and I know, knowing you, that it comes from a very good place, and I do appreciate it. While we disagree on the sort of metaphysics of it all, I want you to know I do appreciate it. I wonder if we can then end with, and I do think that's a very good statement, and I think what I hear in there too is the plea that, you know, so what other resources? I'm going to recommend that people go to the CARM Discord server. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that I'm saying that for two groups. I'm recommending it for the non-believers who want to sort of seek out more about this message that Baptist has joined us to share. Some of it I know is familiar to you if you follow this stuff on YouTube, but some of it is unfamiliar, and they're there for good conversation, not the heated fights. I would also make that recommendation for people who are looking for fellowship and some resources in their ministry efforts, or at least just, you know, understanding their path and feeling better. So I don't participate in their fellowship very much. I used to a bit, but you know, whenever, I don't get into that now. But you'd say they have good fellowship over there, right? So you probably recommend that to the Christians who are viewers of my channel. Okay. Are there any other resources you'll say? And at that point I'll end the broadcast. You can stick around for a minute and I'll say my good nights to you. But I'm going to end the broadcast after. Are there any other resources that you'd recommend people go to? Your YouTube channel is Baptist702. I
only have like 2 or 3 videos on there anyway. So I recommend people go to carm.org or go to the CARM server on Discord. Also, gotquestions.org. Let me put that in the gotquestions.org. Oh,
and it was 2 words. I know what you meant. It's all one. It's like this. What's it got? Pardon my typing while your phone's in. It's gotquestions.org. Yeah. So anyway, those links will be in the live feed. I may in the near future move them over to the video description too. There were several. So during this video, we discussed the Born Believers book. It's available on Amazon, and we talked about so Jason Lyle. There's a 57-minute video that explains some of the questions that I had answers to that I think Baptist very respectfully said, well, this guy has a good answer. So I'm going to actually spend some time with those. And other than that, yeah, I got to say thank you. So I'm going to end the broadcast with that and say our good nights to the audience. And then always fun. What a fun audience. I should have paid more attention to the live chat. You're smart people. So have a good night and a better day tomorrow.